Crocodile paradox. You're standing by a murky river, the water dark and slow, as though time itself has thickened into sludge. The air is heavy with silence, broken only by the occasional ripple from below, and then, without warning, a crocodile emerges, silent, ancient, knowing. Clamped between its jaws is your child. Your heart is a thunderstorm, your breath shallow, your mind blank with fear. But this is no ordinary predator. This crocodile speaks, its voice flat and eerie, void of emotion. It says, "I will return your child if and only if you correctly predict what I will do next." And just like that, you are caught, not merely in a battle for your child's life, but in a trap of logic and language. In this moment, you are no longer just a parent. You are a participant in one of the most confounding paradoxes of all time. The crocodile paradox is not a test of courage or strength. It's a test of certainty, of reasoning, of trust and contradiction. The moment the creature utters its condition, you are thrust into a loop, a logical snare from which there may be no escape. Your options narrow to two predictions. Either you say the crocodile will return your child, or you say it will not. On the surface, this appears simple, but the deeper you think, the more the ground beneath your certainty dissolves. Because both answers lead to impossible knots in logic, each one unraveling itself the moment you try to tie it tight. No answer satisfies the condition without also violating it. Let's explore the first possibility. Suppose you say, "You will return my child." If the crocodile planned to return the child anyway, then your prediction is accurate, and the crocodile must honor its word. The deal is fulfilled. But if the crocodile had no intention of returning the child, then your prediction is false, and the crocodile is free to keep the child. This version creates no conflict, the outcome matches the prediction, and the rules hold firm. But the paradox doesn't reside in this branch of reasoning. It lives in the second path, the one that coils around itself like a serpent devouring its tail. Now imagine you say, "You will not return my child." If the crocodile intended to keep the child, then your prediction is true. But now, by the rules of the bargain, the crocodile must return the child because you predicted correctly. And yet, if it returns the child, your prediction becomes false, breaking the crocodile's own terms. But if it doesn't return the child, then your prediction remains true, forcing the crocodile to return the child. The logic spirals. The crocodile is trapped by its own condition, and so are you. Each action contradicts the terms. No matter which direction the crocodile moves, it steps into a contradiction. This is the essence of a self-referential paradox. Like the sentence, "This statement is false." If it's true, then it must be false. If it's false, then it must be true. The crocodile's condition loops back onto itself, collapsing under the weight of its own conditions. This paradox isn't merely about a parent and a predator. It's about the limits of logic when it folds in on itself. It asks, what happens when rules create a system where no consistent action can be taken without contradiction? But there's something more subtle at work here. The crocodile paradox also interrogates the nature of trust and promise. A promise is a kind of bridge across time, a vow that something will happen later if something else happens now. But in this case, the bridge is rigged to collapse the moment you try to cross it. What is a promise worth if fulfilling it creates a contradiction? What happens when the rules of trust become impossible to satisfy? These questions bleed out from the paradox into our lives. Think of a contract filled with hidden terms, or a promise made under conditions designed to be unkeepable. The crocodile's logic mirrors situations where power disguises itself as fairness, but only offers illusions of choice. And the crocodile, what is it, really? A metaphor, perhaps, for systems that hold power over outcomes, but define the rules so that no answer can succeed. In this light, the crocodile isn't just a beast, it's bureaucracy. It's flawed institutions, it's a voice that says, "You are free to choose." but all your choices lead back to me. The paradox becomes more than an intellectual exercise. It becomes a mirror of authority that gives you the right to guess, but rigs the outcome no matter what you choose. The crocodile in that moment is the architect of a game you can never win. And this is where the paradox earns its depth. It isn't merely a puzzle, it's a commentary on the fragility of logic when it's weaponized. When a system is built not to serve fairness, but to preserve its own control, paradoxes like this arise naturally. And just like that, a question that began by the riverside in the jaws of a crocodile stretches itself across politics, law, and human relationships. It whispers about games we're forced to play, games with rules that cancel themselves out, traps that don't look like traps until we're already caught. Can the paradox be resolved? Most philosophers say no, because the contradiction is baked into the structure. It's not an error you can fix. It's the consequence of conditions that refuse to play by the same rules they demand of others. Some have suggested that the paradox only works because the crocodile's logic is flawed from the beginning. That perhaps a deal based on a prediction of itself cannot logically function. But that's the very point. The paradox exposes how circular logic can seem fair while being fatally flawed. And this realization is as unsettling as it is enlightening. But perhaps there's another way to view the paradox, not as something to be solved, but as something to be seen clearly. A lighthouse, not a maze. A warning, not a challenge. Because sometimes, life presents you with choices that only appear to be choices. Promises that feel sincere until you examine the fine print. Systems that invite your participation while holding all the power. The crocodile paradox is a story, yes, but it's also a lens, a way of seeing. A method for detecting when fairness is just a disguise for entrapment. And in that light, maybe the most powerful move you can make isn't to answer the crocodile at all. Maybe it's to recognize that the game was rigged from the beginning. That there is no right guess because the logic isn't built to reward truth, it's built to collapse upon itself. And maybe, just maybe, by seeing the trap clearly, you free yourself from its grip, not by winning, but by refusing to play. So if you ever find yourself standing by a metaphorical river, face to face with a situation that demands an impossible choice, where every answer loops back into contradiction, remember the crocodile paradox. Remember that not all promises are designed to be kept, not all systems are meant to be navigated. Some are only meant to be seen for what they are. And in that clarity, there is power. Not the power to win, perhaps, but the power to understand. And in understanding, you may find a freedom that no answer could ever grant. The paradox of the court. There is an old tale from ancient Greece, told in the quiet corners of philosophy, where logic meets law and confusion masquerades as justice. It's called the paradox of the court. At first glance, it seems like a simple dispute between a teacher and his student, between a promise and a payment. But as the details unfold, so does the riddle, spiraling into a web of contradictions that neither side can resolve without undoing their own reasoning. In this paradox, both the teacher and the student are right, and yet both are also wrong. A case where justice and logic stare each other down and neither blinks. The story begins with Protagoras, a wise and celebrated sophist, known for teaching the art of persuasion and argument. A young man named Euathlus approaches him, eager to learn the law. But there's a problem. Euathlus cannot afford to pay the full fee for his education, so the two strike an agreement. Protagoras will teach him everything he knows about law and courtroom argumentation. In return, Euathlus will pay Protagoras his fee only after he wins his first court case. It seems fair. It seems logical. But this agreement, as we'll see, holds the seed of a logical explosion. Time passes. Euathlus completes his education, absorbing the wisdom and strategy Protagoras imparts. But then something unexpected happens. Euathlus never enters a courtroom. He avoids legal work entirely. No lawsuits, no clients, no verdicts. As months stretch into years, Protagoras grows restless. His fee remains unpaid, his end of the deal seemingly dangling in limbo. Eventually, he has had enough. So, in an ironic twist, the teacher sues the student. He takes Euathlus to court in an effort to force him to pay the fee he believes he is owed. And this is where the paradox begins to tighten around them both. Protagoras steps forward with a confident claim. "If I win this case," he says, "the court will order Euathlus to pay me, and I will receive what I am owed. But if I lose this case, then Euathlus will have won, and by the terms of our agreement, he will then owe me the fee anyway, whether by verdict or by contract, he gets paid." But Euathlus, sharp and clever, presents the mirror image. "If I win this case," he says, "the court will rule that I do not owe Protagoras anything, and if I lose, I still won't have to pay because I haven't won a case yet. Our contract only requires me to pay after my first courtroom victory, and this wouldn't count." Just like Protagoras, Euathlus argues that he too wins either way. No matter the outcome, he believes he walks away without paying a single coin. So here they are, locked in a courtroom not just by law, but by logic. Each one claims an airtight argument. Each one builds a fortress of reasoning around their position. And yet, when you step back, you see the cracks. If Protagoras wins the case, the court orders payment, but that means Euathlus has not yet won, and so the contract hasn't been triggered. If Euathlus wins, then by contract he owes payment, but the court has just said he does. The arguments cancel each other out, and no decision seems to satisfy both the contract and the verdict. What we have here is a paradox born from a conditional promise entangled with circular logic, a deal that folds back onto itself the moment you try to enforce it. It's the legal version of a Mobius strip, a surface with only one side, where every direction leads back to the beginning. And it forces us to confront a difficult truth, that sometimes even the most rational agreements can lead to irrational outcomes, that the machinery of logic can spin so fast it tears itself apart. This paradox raises profound questions about the nature of law and reason. What does it mean to owe something if the condition for that debt cannot logically occur? How do we resolve conflicts where fulfilling a promise breaks the very rule that promise was built upon? These are not just legal puzzles. They are reflections of real-life dilemmas, of contracts written with fine print that traps both parties, of systems so rigid that they collapse under the weight of exceptions. The paradox of the court also challenges our trust in legal reasoning. In theory, the law is built on clarity and order. But this case shows us that even within that structure, contradictions can hide. That logic, when pushed into loops, doesn't always lead to clarity. Sometimes it leads to paralysis. Courts rely on precedent, on interpretation, on human judgment to navigate these loops. But what happens when the contradiction is not in the evidence, but in the structure of the case itself? To resolve the paradox, some suggest the agreement between Protagoras and Euathlus was flawed from the start, that it created an infinite delay, where payment could be postponed forever as long as Euathlus refused to practice law. Others argue that the court must step outside the paradox, using practical reasoning to choose one outcome over the other, even if the logic seems to protest. But neither option feels fully satisfying, because this isn't a problem that can be solved. It's a problem that shows us the limits of solving. And this, perhaps, is the real value of the paradox of the court. Not in its resolution, but in its illumination. It shows us the fragile line between justice and absurdity. It reminds us that human systems, whether legal, social, or logical, are built on assumptions that can be twisted. That words, even when carefully arranged, can betray us if we forget their limitations. The paradox is not a mistake in thinking, it's a spotlight on the places where thinking fails. So what do we do with a paradox like this? We hold it gently, like a strange artifact. We don't rush to fix it, but we study it. We let it whisper to us about caution, about humility, about the traps hidden inside clever ideas. Because while most of our lives operate on simple logic, if this, then that, there are moments when that simplicity unravels. And in those moments, the paradox of the court waits like a quiet lesson from the past, reminding us that not all disputes can be untangled with reason alone. Perhaps that's why this ancient story still survives, because in every age we encounter situations where doing what's right leads to contradiction, and where following rules leaves us lost. The courtroom may be symbolic, but the conflict is real, in families, in businesses, in governments. It's the problem of mutually exclusive expectations, of deals that devour themselves, of contracts that punish compliance. And in those moments, the paradox returns, not to frustrate us, but to teach us to see more deeply. So if you ever find yourself caught in a situation where every choice undermines itself, where agreement turns to contradiction, and certainty fades into a loop, remember Protagoras and Euathlus. Remember that, even in the most structured systems, logic has its shadows. And sometimes, the wisest move is not to solve the paradox, but to recognize it, to see it clearly, to understand that not every tangle needs to be undone. Some are simply there to remind us that clarity is a journey, not a guarantee. The Drinker Paradox. In a dimly lit bar, there's a crowd of strangers lost in conversation. Some are laughing, some are sipping in silence. Glasses clink. Time drifts slowly, like smoke curling toward the ceiling. And somewhere in that crowd, perhaps at the end of the counter or tucked in the corner booth, is a person who unknowingly completes one of the strangest, most counterintuitive truths in logic. It's called the Drinker Paradox, and on the surface, it sounds absurd, but the deeper you stare into it, the more it reveals something astonishing about certainty, implication, and the eerie dance of statements that fold back on themselves. The paradox begins with a simple claim. In every bar, there is someone such that if that person is drinking, then everyone in the bar is drinking. The first time you hear it, you might frown, puzzled. It seems too bold, too sweeping. It suggests that the drinking habits of a single individual could determine the drinking status of the entire room. It feels like a logical sleight of hand, a trick played with words. How could one person's action imply the behavior of an entire group? Surely the world doesn't work this way. And yet, in logic, the claim holds true. Every time. To understand it, you must step into the abstract world of formal logic, where meaning isn't measured by feeling, but by structure. The key lies in the nature of implication, specifically in how we understand the statement, if A, then B. In ordinary conversation, that phrase carries weight. It implies cause and effect, or a moral condition. But in formal logic, if A, then B is considered true in all cases except one, when A is true and B is false. This definition unlocks the paradox, but also creates a rift between how we speak and how logic works beneath the surface. Imagine a bar with many people. Some are drinking, some are not. Now, take two extreme cases. Suppose everyone is drinking. Then any person you choose will satisfy the statement. If they are drinking, then everyone is drinking, because they are drinking and everyone is. The implication is true. Now, flip it. Suppose no one is drinking. Pick anyone again. The statement becomes, if this person is drinking, then everyone is drinking. But here, the person isn't drinking, and, in logic, an implication with a false premise is always true. So again, the statement holds. There is always someone in the bar who satisfies it. Oh, this is what makes the Drinker Paradox so unsettling. It doesn't claim that one person causes everyone else to drink. It doesn't suggest a mystical influence or a magical ripple of behavior. It merely shows that in the world of logical implication, a certain kind of sentence will always be true, regardless of what's actually happening in the room. The paradox isn't about alcohol or bars, it's about truth, and how we define it in the quiet architecture of logic. And yet, there's something eerie about it, because the sentence feels wrong even though it's right. It highlights the disconnection between formal systems and intuitive understanding. We expect logic to reflect common sense, but sometimes it reflects something deeper, something colder, more precise, and less human. The drinker paradox reminds us that logic doesn't always care about meaning in the way we do. It only cares about structure, about the internal consistency of statements, about the shape of thought without the color of experience. But this paradox also invites us to reflect on implication in our own lives. How often do we assume that if this then that reflects causality when it may only reflect association or convenience? We say things like, "If she cares, she'll call," or "If I try, I'll succeed," embedding emotion and expectation into our reasoning. But these aren't the same as logical implications. They're stories we tell ourselves, useful maybe, but not necessarily true. The drinker paradox peels away the narrative and shows us the bones of implication. It's not a story, it's a structure. And it whispers something else too, that sometimes the presence of truth doesn't depend on who it points to, but on how it's framed. The person who makes the statement true doesn't need to know they are doing it. They don't need to change anything. They only need to exist in a specific relationship to the group. The paradox exists because of the group's composition, not because of the individual's intention. That's a strange kind of invisibility, where you're part of a truth simply by being placed in the right configuration, like a piece in a puzzle that completes the image without knowing it. It also asks us to question the boundaries between individual and collective behavior. When does one person's condition reflect the group, and when is it just an isolated fact? In society, we often overestimate the influence of the individual. We point to figureheads and say, if they fall, everything will fall. But the drinker paradox reminds us that the relationship between one and many is more nuanced. Sometimes the group makes the truth true, not through action but through implication, through the strange dance of logic that binds everyone together, whether they know it or not. And then there's the quiet philosophical core of the paradox, the idea that truth can exist independently of observation. No one in the bar needs to know who the person is. No one needs to test the statement, and yet, the statement remains true. It's a truth without witness, without experiment, without revelation. It just is. And that, too, is unsettling. We like to think that truth is something we discover, something that waits to be revealed. But in formal logic, some truths don't care whether we find them. They exist, cold and unblinking, in the structure of what must be. So if you ever find yourself in a crowded room, surrounded by conversations and half-empty glasses, think of the drinker paradox. Somewhere in that room, without anyone noticing, is a person who fulfills the strangest logical statement you've ever heard. And maybe they're drinking. Or maybe they're not. It doesn't matter. What matters is that the truth exists, not because of choice or intention, but because of how the world is arranged. The truth was waiting there all along, hiding in plain sight, silently binding the group with invisible threads of logic. This paradox is more than a curiosity. It's a lesson in humility. It shows us that the world of logic operates on principles that sometimes defy our intuition. It teaches us to question the meanings we assign to cause, to consequence, to statements we take for granted, and it reminds us that some of the most unsettling truths are not the ones that scream, but the ones that whisper softly from the corners of our minds, asking us to think a little more carefully, a little more deeply, before we speak. So the next time you hear someone say, "If this happens, then that must follow," pause. Ask yourself, what kind of implication are they making? Is it built on logic or on emotion? Is it structure or story? And if it's structure, remember the paradox that lives in the bar, the quiet logic that doesn't need to be seen to be true, the strange idea that one person in just the right place makes the entire room echo with an unseen truth. That, perhaps, is the most powerful thing of all, the Raven Paradox. In a quiet field under a cloud-streaked sky, a black raven lands on the branch of a pale tree. It caws once and turns its eyes to the horizon, still and thoughtful, as though contemplating something older than time. At first glance, this moment seems simple, just a bird, a tree, and the silent breath of nature. But in the world of philosophy and logic, that raven carries a question that has puzzled minds for generations, a paradox, a contradiction, a quiet disruption of how we think we understand truth and confirmation. This is the Raven Paradox, and it begins not with a bird, but with a sentence. All ravens are black. It's a statement that feels true, at least as far as everyday experience tells us. You may have seen many ravens, and perhaps they've all been black. You may have never seen one that wasn't. So intuitively we accept it, but science doesn't rely on intuition. It relies on observation and confirmation. And here's the puzzle. How do we confirm that all ravens are black? According to logic, we do so by looking for black ravens. Each time we see one, it supports the claim. That's easy enough, but then something strange happens. Logically, the sentence, "all ravens are black," is equivalent to another statement. If something is not black, then it is not a raven. This is called the contrapositive. In logic, a statement and its contrapositive are always equivalent. They say the same thing in different words. But this leads to an unsettling idea. Suppose you are walking through a market and you see a green apple. That apple is not black, and it is certainly not a raven. According to logic, this green apple confirms the statement, "all ravens are black." And that feels wrong. Why would a green apple tell us anything about ravens? It seems absurd. A fruit, in a market, miles from any bird, somehow strengthening our belief in a universal truth about feathers and wings. This is the core of the Raven Paradox, that every non-Beck, non-Raven, every white shoe, every yellow pencil, every blue car, logically supports the claim that all ravens are black. But intuitively we reject this. We don't feel closer to the truth about ravens by seeing things that are clearly not ravens at all. And yet, the logic holds. The paradox was first introduced by the philosopher Carl Hempel in the mid-20th century. He wanted to explore the nature of confirmation, how we come to believe universal statements based on limited observation, and what he found was a hole in our intuition, a place where logic and experience part ways. In pure formal reasoning, every piece of evidence that fits the contrapositive should count, but in human minds, that evidence feels hollow, distant, irrelevant. So we are left with a split. On one side, the mathematical beauty of logic, telling us that every green apple is a friend to our belief in black ravens, and on the other, our sense of meaning and relevance, telling us that only actual ravens should matter. The paradox lives in that gap. It thrives in the discomfort between what must be true in theory and what feels useful in practice. Some have tried to resolve this paradox by looking more deeply at the idea of relevance. Not all confirmations are equal, they say. Seeing 1,000 black ravens is more significant than seeing 1,000 white plates. Even if both are technically confirming evidence, one is stronger, more direct, more meaningful. This leads us into Bayesian reasoning, where belief is not simply confirmed or not, but updated in degrees based on how much the new information matters. In this view, the green apple does help, but so little that we barely register it. Others argue that the problem is not with the logic, but with the way we interpret universal claims. All ravens are black is not just a logical form, it's a reflection of the real world. And in the real world, not all possibilities are equal. The universe is full of non-Beck, non-Ravens. Infinite, perhaps, and so each new one adds so little weight to our belief that it's practically meaningless. But still, the paradox remains, because the logic doesn't care how much the confirmation weighs, it only cares that it confirms. This is what makes the Raven paradox more than a puzzle. It is a mirror. It shows us the subtle ways in which human thought bends around usefulness, meaning, and context. We are not perfect reasoners, we are storytellers, pattern finders. We care about what feels connected, what speaks directly to the idea at hand. And while logic may accept every quiet nod from a green apple, our minds crave something more direct. A raven, black as the night, in the wild, under the sky. That is the kind of confirmation we trust. But perhaps the most beautiful aspect of the Raven paradox is the way it makes us slow down and question the act of knowing itself. How do we know what we know? How do we build belief from scattered experience? Is the world built from tight logical structures, or from soft patterns that whisper to us through intuition and relevance? The paradox doesn't answer these questions. It simply raises them, gently, like a raven lifting off from a branch into still air. It also reminds us that knowledge is not only about correctness, it's about connection, about how ideas link together in the mind. A child who learns that all dogs bark doesn't confirm it by observing cats. They watch dogs. They listen. They build belief through direct alignment. And yet, in logic, the child could just as well notice that a fish doesn't bark and feel a tiny tug of confirmation. This is the gap between form and feeling, the gap the Raven paradox illuminates. In this way, the paradox offers something quiet and valuable. Not just a challenge, but a perspective. It shows us that even the simplest statements can hide complexity, that the act of confirmation is not as clean as we might think, and that the human mind, while powerful, walks a delicate line between logic and meaning. We want truth to feel intuitive, but sometimes truth is more subtle than that. So if you ever find yourself in a quiet moment, watching a raven settle onto a branch, or picking up a green apple in a market, pause. Let the paradox unfold in your mind. Think of the strange logic that connects the two. Feel the tension between reason and relevance, and let it remind you that understanding the world is not a straight path, but a winding trail. One that loops through intuition and logic, through the expected and the strange, but trails that leads not just to answers, but to deeper ways of asking the question. Because in the end, the Raven paradox is not a flaw, it is a feature, a quiet guide that shows us the limits of strict reasoning and the power of curiosity. It invites us to see the beauty in contradiction, the richness in confusion, and the strange, soft music that plays when logic and life share the same stage. It's not just a puzzle for philosophers, it's a story about how we think, how we see, and how we reach for certainty in a world that often refuses to give it. The Grellen-Nelson paradox. Imagine standing in a quiet library, surrounded by shelves of language, words about words, books about how to use books. Here, meaning loops back on itself. Here, language is not just a tool, but a mirror. And somewhere, tucked between the pages of an old logic text or whispered through the air in a philosophy class, lives one of the strangest paradoxes ever to arise from self-reference. It doesn't speak of birds or courtrooms or games, it speaks of adjectives, those humble words that decorate our thoughts. This is the Grellen-Nelson paradox, and it begins with a simple question: can a word describe itself? At first, the idea sounds almost playful. Adjectives describe things after all. Some describe colors like blue or crimson. Others describe emotions, joyful, anxious. But then there are adjectives that describe themselves. The word short is short. The word English is English. These are called autological adjectives. They possess the property they describe, but others do not. The word long is not long. The word French is not a French word. These are heterological adjectives. They do not possess the quality they name. So we create a division: autological on one side, heterological on the other. It seems simple at first, just a classification, a neat way to label words according to whether they describe themselves. But then the trouble begins, because someone, perhaps Grelling or Nelson, asks the next question. What about the word heterological itself? Is it heterological? That is, does it not describe itself? And suddenly, the ground beneath the concept begins to crack, because both answers lead us into contradiction. If we say that heterological is heterological, then by definition, it does not describe itself. But that means it does describe itself, because being heterological means not describing itself, and if it is heterological, it must not be. But if we say that heterological is not heterological, then it must describe itself. But that would make it autological and thus not heterological. Each attempt to classify the word flips back into its opposite. The loop tightens, the paradox reveals itself. This is the Grellian-Nelson paradox. It is not a trick of wording, but a structural collapse caused by self-perpeter. It's a linguistic cousin of Russell's paradox, which asks whether the set of all sets that do not contain themselves contains itself. These questions are built like Mobius strips, one-sided surfaces that twist in such a way that walking along them brings you back to where you started, but invert. The paradox doesn't lie in the meaning of the words themselves, but in the framework we try to place around them. Language turning inward and breaking in the process. But why does this matter? It matters because language is how we build our worlds. It's how we describe, categorize, and understand. And when language fails, when it leads to contradiction from within, we see the edges of its power. The Grelling-Nelson paradox shows us that, even in systems as familiar and fundamental as language, self-reliance creates instability. The very tools we use to build knowledge can, under certain conditions, saw themselves in half. And yet, this paradox is not just a warning, it's a mirror. It reflects the limits of classification, the fragility of systems that try to define everything, including themselves. We crave order. We want to sort the world into bins, true and false, black and white, self-descriptive and not. But the Grelling-Nelson paradox whispers that some things resist sorting, that the moment a system turns to examine itself, it risks falling into contradiction. This is not just a linguistic problem, it's a philosophical one, a logical one, a human one. We encounter similar loops in identity, in thought, in self-awareness. When a mind thinks about itself, or a belief questions its own validity, or a rule applies to the rules themselves, we often find the same kinds of paradoxes: feedback loops, infinite regress, contradiction. The Grelling-Nelson paradox becomes a symbol for all moments when we try to define something that is both the observer and the observed. Language is simply the medium here, but the lesson is much larger. In this light, the paradox becomes something almost sacred, a doorway into the deep tension between self and system, a reminder that not all things can be fully understood from within their own frame. Like trying to lift yourself by your own bootstraps or to look into your own eyes without a mirror. The Grelling-Nelson paradox teaches us about boundaries, the edges of logic, the soft walls of definition. It tells us that every system, no matter how complete, may contain questions it cannot answer. And this humility is important. In a world where information grows faster than understanding and systems become increasingly complex, we need to remember the fragility of our tools. The paradox is not there to destroy language or mock logic. It's there to remind us of their limitations, that even the cleanest structures can contain cracks, that self-representation is not a game, but a fundamental challenge at the heart of reasoning. Some have tried to resolve the paradox by denying that heterological can be classified at all, that it's a special case, exempt from the categories it tries to belong to. Others rework the logic of language itself, refining the rules of set theory, or introducing new kinds of hierarchies. But these solutions, while valuable, do not erase the unease. They only relocate it. Because the paradox was never just about words. It was about the strange tension between what can be said and what can be known, between expression and reflection. And in this tension, there's beauty. There's something deeply human about running into the limits of understanding. It humbles us. It reminds us that the map is not the territory, that our classifications are scaffolds, not truths. The Grelling-Nelson paradox invites us to dwell in that space, not to fix it, but to feel it, to recognize the quiet poetry of contradiction, the way a word can fold back on itself and become a riddle, a mystery, a mirror. So, if you ever find yourself wondering about the nature of meaning, or about whether a thought can describe itself, or whether a sentence can contain its own undoing, remember the paradox that lives in adjectives. Remember, heterological, a word that, like a question with no clear answer, offers only reflection. And maybe, in that reflection, you'll find something more than logic. You'll find awareness, not of how the system works, but of where it stops. And that, too, is a kind of knowledge. Because some of the most powerful lessons in life come not from answers, but from the realization that some questions are unresolvable, that some loops are unbreakable, that some thoughts, once thought, spiral into themselves endlessly. The Grelling-Nelson paradox is one of those thoughts, a silent spiral, a word that turns into a question, and the question into a paradox, and the paradox into a reflection of your own mind watching itself think. The Ross Littlewood paradox. Picture a large urn resting quietly on a table in an empty room. There is nothing remarkable about the urn, just polished glass open at the top, hollow and waiting. But this urn will become the stage for a paradox that quietly dismantles our understanding of infinity, of time, of motion, and completion. It's known as the Ross Littlewood paradox, and, like many paradoxes, it begins with something simple, balls being added and removed from the urn in a specific sequence. But as you watch the process unfold, something starts to feel off. Because what begins as a straightforward counting game ends with a conclusion so strange, so counterintuitive, that it leaves the mind quietly spinning in place. Imagine the urn is empty. At 1 minute to midnight, you add 10 numbered balls into it, balls labeled 1 through 10. Then you remove one ball, let's say ball number 1. 30 seconds later, at 30 seconds to midnight, you add another 10 balls, numbered 11 through 20, and remove ball number 2. 15 seconds later, you add balls 21 through 30 and remove ball number 3. You continue like this, doubling the frequency each time. Every round, you add 10 new balls and remove just 1. The intervals shrink, 7.5 seconds, 3.75 seconds, and so on. By the time midnight arrives, you've repeated the process infinitely many times. And now the question arises, how many balls are left in the urn? Intuitively, you might think the urn is overflowing. After all, you're adding 10 balls each time and removing just 1. That's a net gain of 9 balls per step. 9 times infinity should be a lot, an infinite number, surely. But logic has a quiet surprise waiting. If you trace each individual ball, you'll find that it was eventually removed. Ball 1 was removed in the first step, ball 2 in the second, ball 3 in the third, and so on. Every ball you ever added has a number, and every numbered ball is removed in some future step. None remain. At midnight, the urn is empty. And yet, at the same time, you performed infinitely many steps, adding more and more balls than you removed. How can both be true? How can you endlessly add and still end up with nothing? This is the heart of the Ross-Littlewood paradox. It reveals the subtle tension between two kinds of infinity, the number of operations and the number of elements involved. It shows that the idea of infinity isn't a singular thing, but a family of behaviors that defy our finite intuition. In the finite world, process and result are aligned. If you add more than you take away, you end up with more. If you repeat something often enough, it accumulates. But infinity breaks that contract. When the steps are infinite, strange rules take over. The order of operations matters. The identity of each object becomes crucial. Infinity allows you to do things that feel impossible, like remove every item you ever added, while still having added more than you removed. It's not that math is lying. It's that our sense of balance and fairness doesn't hold up under infinity's gaze. But the paradox doesn't stop there. What if instead of removing the lowest numbered ball each time, you removed a random one, or one with a higher number? Would that change the outcome? It turns out it does. The result depends entirely on the rule used for removal. If you always remove the highest numbered ball, then more and more low-numbered balls remain. If you remove randomly, the result becomes unpredictable. The paradox exposes how, under infinite operations, the outcome is not determined only by quantity, but by the structure of actions. This is what makes the Ross-Littlewood paradox so unsettling. It forces us to accept that the infinite is not just a larger version of the finite. It is something else entirely. A realm where intuitive rules are suspended, where order trumps arithmetic, where infinite processes can contradict finite expectations. In that realm, even the idea of completion becomes slippery. Midnight arrives, but what does it mean to say the process is finished? Each step approached midnight but never touched it, until, suddenly, it does. And in that final instant, the result is nothing. The paradox also echoes something profound about time itself. Each action happens closer and closer to midnight, compressing an infinite sequence into a finite duration. It's as if time folds in on itself, allowing eternity to play out in a single moment. This speaks to the Zeno-like nature of the paradox, where motion and stillness, addition and disappearance, coexist in unsettling harmony. Time is not a passive backdrop here, it is the very stage on which infinity reshapes logic. But beyond math and time, the Ross-Littlewood paradox is also a parable about accumulation. About how the things we build, habits, memories, even ideas, can disappear if we don't pay attention to how they're kept. It's not just about what you add to your life, but about what you subtract, and how. Every step seems to build, but if every gain is eventually canceled out, what remains? The urn becomes a metaphor for effort without permanence, creation without retention, an infinite act of building that quietly erases itself. And in that metaphor is a quiet warning that infinite effort without careful intention can lead to emptiness, that adding more is not the same as gaining, that without structure, infinity can undo everything. This isn't just a mathematical insight, it's a reflection of the human experience. We live our lives adding days, memories, experiences, but what if they all vanish in the end? Not because we failed to collect them, but because of the rules by which we let them go. The Ross-Littlewood paradox does not offer an answer. It simply stands there, like the empty urn, inviting contemplation. It asks us to consider what it means to complete a process that never truly ends, to reach the edge of time and find that everything we thought would accumulate has vanished. It's not a puzzle to be solved, it's a mirror to be held up to our assumptions about growth, about permanence, about the way things build and decay. And yet, in the silence after midnight, the paradox leaves something behind. Not balls, not numbers, but insight. A deeper awareness that infinity is not always expansive, sometimes it's subtractive. sometimes it reveals how fragile our notions of progress really are. In this way, the paradox becomes not just a curiosity, but a meditation, a reminder that not all effort leads to gain, that infinite steps can arrive at zero, and that the rules we follow shape more than the path, they shape the destination. So if you ever find yourself imagining progress as a straight line, as a series of additions, of successes, of forward motion, remember the urn. Remember the shrinking steps, the disappearing numbers, the final emptiness. And let it remind you that meaning is not found in the quantity of what you do, but in the quality of how it's done. The Ross Littlewood paradox doesn't warn us away from the infinite. It invites us to respect it, to understand that not all infinities are created equal, and that even endless effort must be guided by clarity and care. Benedetti's paradox. Imagine walking down a quiet road, the sky dimming to a soft gray as the evening unfolds. The path is straight, stretching forward into the distance like a line drawn between moments. But something stops you. Not a wall, not a locked gate. Nothing physical, just a feeling, something unseen, unmeasurable, but real enough to make you hesitate. Ahead, there are no obstacles, and yet, for some reason, you cannot take the next step. This is the essence of Benedetti's paradox, a strange and silent conflict between motion and reason. A thought experiment that exposes the limits of action when infinite barriers are invisible but implied. The paradox begins with a simple setup. A traveler walks along a road, heading toward a destination, but then something strange happens. At a certain point, a guardian appears, an obstacle that says, "If you reach this point, I will stop you." So the traveler pauses, and just before they would have reached that point, another guardian appears. This one stands just before the last, making the same threat, and then another, and another, and another. An infinite sequence of guardians now lies before the traveler, each one threatening to intervene if the traveler makes it past the one before. But here's the twist. None of the guardians ever has to act, because the traveler never reaches the first one. Every guardian is contingent on the step that comes after, but none of them actually blocks the path. And yet, the traveler is effectively trapped, not by force, not by action, but by the mere presence of threats that are never fulfilled. Motion becomes impossible, not because of what happens, but because of what would happen. And in this, the paradox reveals itself, not through what occurs, but through what doesn't. Benedetti's paradox lives in the gap between potential and reality. It shows us that something can be halted not by a single decisive event, but by an infinite layering of conditions that prevent any event from happening at all. It's not a wall, it's the idea of walls. It's not a prison, it's the implied threat of one. The traveler isn't stopped by a physical force, they are stopped by logic, by an infinite regression of unrealized obstacles. This kind of paradox strikes at the heart of how we understand cause and effect. Normally, we move because nothing stops us. We act unless something intervenes. But in Benedetti's setup, intervention is never required. It's the very structure of the sequence, the infinite converging approach of conditional threats, that creates immobility. And that's what makes it so strange. You could say the traveler is free. There is no single point where force is used, and yet the traveler cannot move. In this way, the paradox becomes a quiet prison of the mind, a stillness built from infinite conditions, rather than any single constraint. To better understand its subtle power, imagine trying to reason your way past the guardians. You might say, "I'll just take one step forward." But the moment you plan to step, you realize that doing so would trigger the next guardian, and so you hesitate. But that hesitation is not caused by an action, it's caused by a cascade of imagined consequences. The entire system is rigged to prevent movement not by acting, but by existing. The paradox becomes a loop of inaction born from infinite anticipation. The traveler is paralyzed not by resistance, but by an overabundance of reasons not to move. This paradox has deep implications, not just in logic but in philosophy, metaphysics, and even psychology. It reminds us that there can be systems so intricately structured, so infinitely recursive, that nothing can occur, not because of a flaw, but because of too much consistency. It's the philosophical equivalent of being frozen by overthinking, a world where every move is countered before it is made. A life where action is impossible not because it's forbidden, but because it's always already prevented. Benardette's paradox also raises questions about determinism and free will. If the traveler's path is blocked by conditions that will only activate in response to their choices, then is the traveler free? Are they being stopped, or are they stopping themselves in response to imagined limits? The guardians are passive until triggered, so the burden of inaction lies in the decision to move. It creates a strange landscape where responsibility and consequence are endlessly deferred, and yet the effect is total. The traveler never takes another step. This framework touches something very real in the human experience. How often are we paralyzed by imagined consequences? How many actions go untaken, not because of real blocks, but because of internal chains of what if? The traveler on the road could be anyone, facing a choice, imagining every possible failure, every potential rejection, every reason to wait just one more moment. And in that waiting, the moment never arrives. The road never continues. The journey ends before it begins. Benardette's paradox thus becomes a metaphor for hesitation, a reflection of the silent ways fear can dress itself as logic. In this light, the guardians are not supernatural or mysterious. They are thoughts, worries, doubts. Every time you prepare to act, another thought arises, whispering, "Be careful." And though no one of them is strong enough to stop you, the infinite chain of them holds you in place like iron. The traveler's path becomes a mirror for the human condition, stuck between intention and fear, progress and paralysis. But the paradox also challenges the way we think about infinity itself. It shows that infinite sequences don't just stretch forever, they can also compress, converge, and still never reach completion. All the guardians in the paradox fit into a finite stretch of road, approaching a limit point but never quite arriving. Just like Zeno's paradoxes, where infinite halves never equal a whole, Benardette's guardians show that infinite steps can fit within finite space and still block it entirely. Infinity in this context becomes dense, not far away, but tightly packed into the very air. And that density has consequences. It means that paradox doesn't live at the edge of reality, it can be found right in the middle of it, on quiet roads, in ordinary choices, in the spaces between thoughts. It means that the infinite isn't something we reach, it's something we can live inside, unknowingly. And in doing so, we may find ourselves trapped in situations that feel impossible, not because of any one thing, but because of the overwhelming possibility of everything. So what is the lesson of Benardette's paradox? Maybe it's that freedom is not just the absence of obstacles, it's the absence of infinite imagined ones. That sometimes, movement requires more than opportunity. It requires a willingness to ignore the entire chain of what-ifs, to step forward, even when the mind lists every reason not to see that none of the guardians has acted, and that perhaps they never will. The traveler, after all, is stopped by prophecy, not presence, by the logic of hesitation, not the logic of reality. And in that realization lies the seed of escape, not by defeating the guardians, but by recognizing that their power lies in expectation, in prediction, in the acceptance of their structure. Once you see that, you realize something else, that the infinite regress only traps you if you accept its rules, that some paradoxes only hold you if you stand still. And so the traveler perhaps could take a step, not through defiance, but through clarity, through the understanding that imagined barriers, even infinite ones, are not the same as real ones. Benardette's paradox doesn't need to be solved, it needs to be seen. It needs to be felt. Because its power lies not in what it says, but in what it reveals about the spaces we construct in our minds. It is a reminder that logic, like fear, can sometimes build perfect cages, and that the key is not in breaking the logic, but in stepping outside it. So if you ever find yourself standing still, unsure why you cannot move, listen closely. Ask yourself if you've been surrounded by guardians, silent, conditional, imagined. And if you have, remember the traveler, remember the road, and remember that sometimes the way forward is not blocked at all. It only seems that way, because we've convinced ourselves that every next step is already promised to be impossible. And yet, it isn't. The absent-minded driver paradox. It begins with a driver. The road is long, stretching forward under the calm breath of night. There are signs, but the signs don't help. There are lights, but they don't guide. This is a journey of decisions, made not with clarity, but with the dull haze of habit and forgetfulness. The driver is absent-minded, not foolish, not careless, but human in a deeply familiar way, prone to distraction, vulnerable to uncertainty. And it is in this forgetfulness that the paradox begins, a situation that quietly unravels our assumptions about rationality, memory, and the nature of decision-making. The driver has a goal, to reach a destination. There are two exits along the way. The first exit is not the right one. If he takes it, he will end up somewhere he doesn't want to be. The second exit is the correct one, but if he misses it, he will be forced to continue on to a less desirable outcome. A costly detour, a dead end, a place he was trying to avoid. The challenge is simple in structure. Skip the first, take the second. But here is the twist. When the driver begins the journey, he knows that by the time he reaches an exit, he will not remember whether it is the first or the second. This forgetfulness is not a minor inconvenience. It is the heart of the paradox. At each exit, the driver will not know which one it is. He cannot count. He cannot recall. All he can do is choose. Should he exit now or continue? And each choice must be made without knowing whether it's too soon or too late. This is not a question of intelligence. It is a question of decision-making under imperfect knowledge, and in that imperfection, a logical maze begins to unfold. Before starting the driver tries to reason through the problem. He thinks, if I assign a probability to exiting, say, a certain percentage chance that I'll take the ramp when I reach it, I can optimize my chances of ending up at the right place. But then the reasoning loops. At the first exit, if he exits, he ends up in the wrong place. At the second, if he passes, he overshoots. But the paradox lies in this. The optimal strategy tells him to sometimes take the first exit because in forgetting and assigning equal likelihood to each point, he must hedge against not recognizing the second exit when it comes. And so rational behavior tells him to act irrationally, to do what he knows is wrong, just to maximize the chance that he eventually gets it right. It's here that the paradox reveals itself, not in the structure of the road, but in the breakdown between knowledge and action. The driver knows what he wants. He knows the layout of the road, but he cannot use that knowledge in the moment it matters. And so he is left with probabilities, with strategies that play against his own certainty. The result is a plan that seems absurd, a plan that, at its core, involves deliberately doing the wrong thing some of the time, because doing only the right thing is no longer possible. This challenges something deep in our understanding of rational choice. Normally, we assume that rationality involves maximizing outcomes, that it means acting in alignment with our goals and values. But the absent-minded driver is rational. He calculates, he prepares, he even chooses the best statistical strategy available. And yet, the outcome is irrational. he may end up in the wrong place, even when he did everything right. The paradox shows us that rational action does not guarantee rational results, not when memory is flawed and knowledge cannot be applied precisely. It's a quiet reminder that being smart is not always enough, that clarity of thought does not always lead to clarity of result. In life, just as on the road, we often make decisions without full knowledge. We act under assumptions. We try to compensate for what we forget, for what we cannot know. And in doing so, we sometimes build strategies that feel wrong, even when they're statistically sound. The paradox becomes not just a thought experiment, but a reflection of our real-world limitations. And it goes deeper. The paradox invites us to question the nature of time and information. At what point is knowledge useful? If the driver cannot use his memory at the exact moment of decision, then is that knowledge truly knowledge? Or is it a ghost? Something that feels like understanding, but fails to guide behavior when it's needed most. This is not just a problem of memory, it is a problem of self-awareness, of context. The driver is lost, not because he lacks intelligence, but because his mind cannot stay present with the timeline his logic creates. In that, there is something deeply human. We make plans with full clarity, but often execute them in a fog. We intend to say the right thing, to take the right turn, to make the best choice, but in the moment, we hesitate, we forget, we guess. The absent-minded driver is all of us, trying to navigate paths we've mapped out long before, but with no way to remember where we are in the journey. He's the student who forgets the studied material during the exam, the person who makes the same mistake again, not out of recklessness, but because memory failed in the moment it mattered. The paradox also speaks to trust in ourselves and in systems. Can we build decision-making frameworks that protect us from our own forgetfulness? Can we design strategies that work even when we cannot see where we are? The driver's optimal plan is a probabilistic one. Exit with a certain chance, pass with a certain chance, repeat. But even that plan feels wrong. It feels like giving in to randomness. And maybe that's the deeper lesson, that under certain conditions, logic and randomness are not opposites, they are partners, working together to form the best approach in an imperfect world. And yet, the paradox is unsettling. It leaves us with no satisfying solution. There is no strategy that guarantees success, only strategies that balance failure. It teaches us humility, that some decisions cannot be optimized in the traditional sense, that sometimes acting in the best way still means losing, that life, like the road, doesn't always reward preparation with success, and that forgetfulness, so often dismissed as a flaw, can completely reshape the logic of how we should act. So what should the driver do? The paradox doesn't answer, it only shows the trap, the gap between knowledge and application, between planning and presence. But in seeing the trap, we gain something else, a kind of awareness, a softness in how we think about failure. We realize that not all mistakes come from poor reasoning. Some come from the simple structure of time and memory, from trying to act rationally in a moment when we cannot fully understand where we are. In that way, the absent-minded driver is not just a character in a thought experiment, he is a reflection of every mind trying to move forward in a world where certainty fades and memory flickers. His story is not a puzzle to be solved, it is a mood, a tone, a question whispered in the dark. How do we act when we cannot remember how far we've come? And how do we forgive ourselves when even the best strategies fail? Perhaps the lesson isn't to avoid forgetfulness, but to build gentleness around it. To understand that even within forgetfulness, even within paradox, there is still a way forward. Maybe not the perfect one, maybe not the one that guarantees arrival, but one that honors the complexity of being human, of trying to navigate a world with an imperfect map. And so, as the road winds on and the signs blur past in the dark, the absent-minded driver continues, not certain, not precise, but still moving. still trying. And in that quiet, uncertain motion, he teaches us something no flawless plan ever could: the GRU paradox. It starts with a color, or rather, a pair of them, green and blue, two shades we know well, distinct, familiar, part of the everyday fabric of perception. But in the space between them, in a strange logical blend of language and time, lives a made-up word: GRU. And it is in this word that a quiet paradox waits, one that calls into question how we understand the future, how we project the past, and whether the patterns we believe in are truly reliable or just illusions in disguise. This is the GRU paradox, and it does not begin with confusion, but with a simple statement: all emeralds are green. We believe this because we've seen it. One emerald, then another, and another, each one gleaming with the same color. This, to us, feels like a confirmation, a pattern, an inductive truth. From what we've observed in the past, we draw a conclusion about the future: that all emeralds, those we've seen and those yet to be seen, are green. It's how we build knowledge. Observation leads to expectation. Expectation leads to belief. But the GRU paradox takes this certainty and quietly turns it upside down. The philosopher Nelson Goodman introduced the concept in the mid-20th century as a way to examine the foundations of induction, the process by which we generalize from specific experiences. He proposed a peculiar predicate: GRU. An object is GRU if it is green before a certain time, say January 1st, 2030, and blue thereafter. So if you look at an emerald today, before that date, and it's green, then it fits both descriptions. It is green and it is GRU. You have no way of distinguishing between the two. The color is the same. The evidence is identical. And yet the predictions diverge. If you believe the emeralds are green, then you expect that future emeralds will also be green. But if you believe the emeralds are GRU, then after the cutoff date, you expect future emeralds to be blue. And here lies the paradox. Both beliefs are equally supported by the same past observations. Every green emerald you've seen up to this moment confirms both green. There is no additional information to help you choose between them. So why do we trust green more than GRU? What makes one more natural, more logical than the other? This is the quiet unease of the GRU paradox. It shows us that our expectations for the future are not just based on evidence. They are shaped by the language we use to describe that evidence. Green feels natural, consistent, time-independent. GRU feels artificial, contrived, conditional. But that difference is in us, not in the data. The paradox reveals that our inductive logic may be less about truth and more about habit, about comfort, about the words we're used to. And that raises deeper questions. Is induction ever truly justified? We say that the sun will rise tomorrow because it has always risen before. But why should the past dictate the future? The GRU paradox asks us to reconsider that confidence. If a new concept like GRU can fit the same past as green and yet produce a wildly different future, then what anchors our belief? What makes us trust one prediction over another? Goodman called this the new riddle of induction, and it lingers not as a puzzle to be solved, but as a challenge to how we think. The paradox also touches on something more fundamental: the problem of projection. When we use the past to infer the future, we assume that the predicates we use are stable, that green today will mean green tomorrow. But GRU breaks that assumption. It's a time-bound word. It changes its meaning based on the moment. It reveals that what we consider stable might actually be flexible, that our concepts might hide shifts we don't notice. Green is only stable because we treat it as such. But if we grew up in a world where GRU was the standard, then green would seem suspicious. This leads to a strange realization. Our reasoning is entangled with our linguistic choices. It's not just about what we observe, but how we describe what we observe. And once you accept that, the foundation of knowledge begins to tremble, because if language shapes logic, then logic is not pure. It is colored by culture, by history, by the invisible paths our words have taken. The GRU paradox is not just a clever trick. It's a mirror showing us the architecture of thought and the cracks that live within it. And yet, there is something beautiful in that vulnerability. The paradox invites us to look more closely at how we build beliefs, to slow down, to examine the scaffolding beneath our convictions. It teaches humility. It reminds us that even our most cherished truths may be more fragile than we think, that the world is not always divided into what is obvious and what is absurd, but rather into what we've learned to call obvious and what we've learned to dismiss. The difference between green and GRU is not evidence, it is expectation. In this way, the GRU paradox is a quiet protest against intellectual laziness. It pushes us to see the invisible assumptions that guide our thinking, to question the categories we take for granted. It asks us to imagine a different lens, a different vocabulary, and to realize that another version of us, speaking another language, might see the same world and draw entirely different conclusions, and that neither of us would be wrong, just differently trained, differently framed. But the paradox doesn't ask us to abandon induction, it simply asks us to acknowledge its limits, to recognize that the leap from past to future is never purely rational. It's a wager, a habit, a trust that the patterns we've seen are real, not just convenient. And maybe that's enough. Maybe what matters is not certainty, but coherence. That our beliefs hang together, even if they don't rest on unshakable ground. The GRU paradox doesn't destroy logic, it refines it. It adds depth, texture, vulnerability. It reminds us that thinking is not a straight line, but a spiral, circling back through language, time, and choice. So if you ever find yourself looking at an emerald, real or imagined, think of the paradox it carries. Think of the future it points to. Will it stay green or turn blue? Both answers are consistent with the past, and yet only one feels right. Ask yourself why. Ask where that feeling comes from, and in doing so, you will have stepped into the heart of the GRU paradox. Not as a critic, but as a participant, a mind watching itself choose, watching itself believe. And maybe in that moment, you'll understand what makes the paradox so powerful. It's not the challenge it poses to science or logic. It's the light it casts on the quiet machinery of thought, on the way we trust the world, on the stories we tell ourselves about what comes next and why. GRU is not just a word, it is a crack in the lens, a question that keeps asking, a shade of uncertainty painted across the surface of belief. And if that shade never quite goes away, maybe that's okay. Because in the space it opens, something else can grow. Not doubt, but depth. A deeper sense of the mystery behind every truth. A quiet reminder that certainty is a choice. And that even in a world of green emeralds, a new word can open a new world. Thomson's lamp paradox. Picture a small room, quiet and timeless. In the center sits a simple table. On it, a lamp. Not ornate, not broken, just a lamp, connected to a switch ready to be turned on or off. It is a device we all know, a thing that obeys commands with certainty. Flip the switch, the light turns on. Flip it again, it goes dark. There is no mystery in its operation, and yet, this unassuming object becomes the center of a paradox so strange, so deceptively simple, that it forces us to question the very nature of change, of time, and of completion. This is Thomson's lamp paradox, a thought experiment that takes place not in the realm of light, but in the strange folds of infinity. It begins with a proposal. Suppose at noon you turn the lamp on, then 30 seconds later you turn it off. After 15 more seconds, you turn it back on. Then off after 7.5 seconds. Then on after 3 3/4, and so on. Each interval is half the previous one, and with each step you flip the switch. On, off, on, off. Forever. The time between flips shrinks with each movement, becoming smaller and smaller. And because each step takes half the time of the last, the entire infinite sequence is completed in exactly 1 minute. At precisely 12:01, you've finished flipping the switch an infinite number of times. And now the question emerges: what is the state of the lamp at that moment? Is it on or is it off? This is where the paradox lives, because no matter which answer you give, it seems to unravel itself. If you say the lamp is on, then you must explain why, since it was turned off last. But if you say it's off, then at some point it was turned on after that. Every state is immediately undone. Every action has a counteraction. No final position holds because no final step was taken. There is no last flip. The sequence has no end, and yet it has a completion. The minute ends, the process is done, but nothing remains settled. This contradiction exposes something strange about infinity, not as a vast distance, but as something that can be compressed, folded into a finite space. We often think of infinity as endless, but here it fits inside 1 minute. An infinite number of actions, one after the other, all performed within 60 seconds. The paradox doesn't question whether this is possible in practice. It assumes it is possible in theory, and in doing so, it forces us to reckon with what infinity really means when it is no longer distant, but immediate. It also forces us to confront the idea of completion. What does it mean for a process to be finished? We like to imagine actions as having conclusions, events as having end states, but in Thomson's lamp, the act of flipping never concludes. It just gets faster, more frequent, until it becomes untraceable, and then it stops, not because the lamp reached a final state, but because time ran out. The lamp story is over, but the story has no ending. It's a process with no final act. And yet, we are asked to name the result: on or off. Some might argue that the paradox is purely semantic, that it's a linguistic trap, playing with ideas we know can't be realized. After all, in the real world, you can't flip a switch infinitely fast. You can't complete infinite steps in finite time. But the point of the paradox is not to mimic reality. It is to push the limits of reasoning, to test what happens when we apply the rules of logic to their extreme. And in doing so, it reveals something unsettling: that our concepts of time and change may break down when faced with infinite processes. Mathematically, we can sum the intervals: 30 seconds, 15, 7.5, 3.75, and so on. The series converges. It adds up neatly to 1 minute. But the actions themselves, the flips, do not converge. They oscillate. They never stabilize. So at 12:01, there's no meaningful way to say what the lamp does, because the sequence doesn't lead to a final state. It doesn't settle into on or off. It simply exists as a blur of contradictions, an infinite storm condensed into a single instant. This challenges our understanding of causality. In the physical world, causes lead to effects. Actions have results. But in this paradox, every action is immediately countered. Every cause is undone by the next. The system becomes caught in an endless loop, a feedback that never resolves. It's like listening to a song that changes direction every note, never settling into a melody. And yet, after 1 minute, the music ends, not with a final chord, but with silence that holds no memory of the song's last tone. And perhaps this is the deeper message of Thomson's lamp: that not all processes yield conclusions, that not all sequences build toward clarity. Some simply demonstrate the limits of understanding. The lamp becomes a metaphor for all the moments in life where outcomes remain undefined, not because of confusion, but because of structural impossibility. It's not just a lesson in logic, it's a reflection of uncertainty, of the spaces between decisions, of the moments when every choice is reversed by the next and the future becomes unknowable by design. Philosophers have tried to resolve the paradox in different ways. Some argue that it's meaningless to ask about the lamp's state at 12:01, that the question itself breaks down because the sequence has no final act. Others suggest that the lamp has no state at all at that time, that it exists in a kind of undefined limbo. But these answers are not meant to satisfy. They are meant to illuminate the limits of the tools we use to describe the world. Thomson's lamp is not about light, it is about the boundary between logic and time. It also hints at something more subtle, the illusion of progress. Each step of the process feels like movement, like something is being done. But in the end, there is no result. The lamp is left without a state. The paradox shows us that activity does not always lead to outcome, that even infinite action may produce nothing. It asks us to reconsider the idea that doing more always builds towards something. In some cases, more is just more. Not better, not clearer, just endlessly reversible. This has real implications beyond thought experiments. In our lives, we often repeat behaviors, habits, choices, back and forth, on and off, without ever reaching resolution. We believe we are progressing, but sometimes we are simply oscillating. We are the lamp, endlessly flipped. And when the moment of reckoning arrives, when the minute is up, we find ourselves unable to say what state we're in. Are we resolved? Are we free? Or have we simply run out of time? The paradox does not answer. It simply presents the question and lets it linger, like the glow of a lamp that might have been on or might have been off, a light that never flickers into certainty. It reminds us that some systems, no matter how carefully constructed, defy conclusion, that some truths resist finality, and that even when all actions are accounted for, the result may still remain unknowable. So the next time you see a light flicker, think of Thomson's lamp. Think of the infinite hidden in the finite, the reversals hidden in progress, the moment when time runs out but certainty never arrives. And let that uncertainty be not a flaw but a feature, a reminder that in some corners of thought and in some corners of life, the final state is not always the point. Sometimes it's the motion, the rhythm, the paradox itself that reveals what we most need to see. Goodman's paradox. There is something quietly comforting about pattern. We look to the sky and see the sunrise. We feel the chill of winter fade into spring. We gather pieces of experience and string them together like beads, drawing meaning from repetition. This is the essence of induction, the ability to generalize from the past, to expect the future to follow the shape of what we have already known. We touch a stove and learn that it burns. We see 100 green emeralds and believe the next one will be green too. This is the rhythm of knowledge. But what if the pattern lies? What if the logic behind our belief has cracks we've never seen? This is where Goodman's paradox begins, not in what we know, but in how we come to know it. Nelson Goodman introduced this paradox not to confuse us, but to illuminate a quiet flaw in one of the most basic principles of reasoning, the principle of confirmation. At its core, this principle says that a universal statement is supported by consistent evidence. All emeralds are green is confirmed every time we see a green emerald. It seems obvious, it seems rational, but Goodman asks us to look closer, to question not the evidence, but the structure we use to interpret it, because hidden in that structure is an ambiguity, one that quietly challenges the reliability of inductive reasoning itself. To illustrate this, Goodman invents a new word, GREW. An object is GREW if it is green before a certain time, say January 1st, 2030, and blue afterward. So when we observe emeralds now, in the present, they are both green and GREW. They satisfy both properties, and so far we have no reason to prefer one over the other. But when 2030 arrives, something shifts. If the next emerald is green, then it fits the predicate, green but not grew. If it's blue, it fits grew but not green. The past supports both predictions. The evidence is the same, but the outcomes diverge. And suddenly, we are lost. Because our system for confirming beliefs, our way of trusting the future to follow the past, has become unmoored. We realize that what we thought was clear was, in fact, shaped by our choice of words. Our belief that emeralds are green and will remain green is not just based on the emeralds themselves. It is based on the linguistic framework we've inherited, and if that framework had used grew instead, we would expect something entirely different. The evidence hasn't changed, the logic hasn't changed, only the language has, and yet the conclusions split. Goodman's paradox shows us that induction is not just about data. It is about predicates, about the properties we use to describe the world. We assume that green is a natural predicate and that grew is artificial. But why? Both describe the same past, both apply to the same set of observations. The only difference is how they behave over time. Green stays constant, grew shifts. But that shift is only a problem if we've already assumed that time independence is a virtue. And here lies the circularity. We prefer green because it helps us make stable predictions. But our predictions are stable only because we've chosen to describe the world with words like green. This circular reasoning is the heart of the paradox. It doesn't invalidate induction, but it shows that induction depends on something outside itself, a judgment about which predicates are projectable or suitable for use in generalization. And that judgment is not dictated by logic alone. It is influenced by convention, by experience, by intuition. We call green projectable because it has worked well in the past, but that's the very reasoning induction uses to justify itself. So we are left in a loop. We trust induction because it has worked, but we define working based on the predicates we've chosen to trust. In this way, Goodman's paradox invites us into a deeper layer of awareness. It doesn't dismantle knowledge, but it asks us to acknowledge its scaffolding, to see that even the most basic tools of thought are built on choices, some conscious, some inherited. It reminds us that objectivity is not purity, but transparency, that our methods of reasoning are not free-leading truths, but delicate bridges anchored in language, context, and trust. And this matters, because in a world drowning in information, we often reach for the comfort of pattern. We see trends and believe they will continue. We observe behavior and predict outcomes. We use the past as a compass. But Goodman reminds us that the compass itself must be questioned, that the direction it points depends not only on where we've been, but on how we've described the journey. And in that realization is both vulnerability and strength. Because the paradox doesn't leave us hopeless. It shows us the value of philosophical humility, the understanding that even our best reasoning carries assumptions, that wisdom lies not in denying those assumptions, but in seeing them clearly, in recognizing when a predicate is chosen because it fits, not because it is inevitable. Goodman calls this the problem of projectability, and it remains one of the most haunting questions in the philosophy of science. How do we decide which descriptions of the world are trustworthy, which will extend into the future, which are more than just convenient labels? Some have tried to answer by appealing to simplicity. Green is simpler than grew. It doesn't change mid-sentence. It doesn't reference time. But simplicity is a value, not a rule. Others argue that our success with green over time justifies its use. But again, that success is the very thing the paradox places in question. And so we orbit the problem, not to solve it, but to understand it more deeply, to see that belief is not just built from what we see, but from how we choose to see it. In this way, Goodman's paradox becomes more than a logical riddle. It becomes a meditation on the nature of understanding. It whispers that every explanation is a framing. Every truth is held within a language, and every act of prediction is a quiet act of faith, that the world tomorrow will resemble the world today, not because it must, but because it has. And even that has is colored by the predicate we've chosen to carry forward. So what do we do with this paradox? We live with it. We carry it gently. We let it remind us that certainty is layered. That even when the evidence feels complete, the conclusion may still carry ambiguity. Not because the world is broken, but because our ways of describing it are endlessly creative. GRU is not a threat, it is a mirror. It reflects the limits of our certainty, the quiet arbitrariness of our confidence, and in seeing that reflection, we gain not doubt, but depth. Perhaps this is the real value of Goodman's paradox, not in breaking belief, but in softening it, in making us more mindful of how we reason, in encouraging us to listen more closely to the quiet structure beneath our thoughts. It shows us that the world is not just a collection of facts, but a canvas of interpretations, and that our task is not to eliminate ambiguity, but to navigate it with care, with curiosity, with clarity. So the next time you make a prediction, ask yourself, what words are guiding me? What assumptions are shaping this thought? And is there a different way the same evidence could be framed? Not to paralyze you with possibilities, but to deepen your trust. To remind you that belief is not brittle, it is flexible, living, open to revision, and that even in the face of paradox, you can move forward, not with false certainty, but with honest awareness. Because that's what Goodman offered. Not confusion, not contradiction, but perspective. A way of seeing how even the most familiar truths are braided with choice, and that in choosing wisely, we can make our knowledge not perfect, but purposeful. Not final, but resilient. The Burali-Forti paradox. Imagine, for a moment, the concept of order, not in the sense of routine or structure in your daily life, but in a more abstract, mathematical sense. Think of arranging things, one after the other, small to large, simple to complex, earlier to later. The idea of putting things in sequence feels natural. We do it constantly, almost without thought. But when that idea is taken to its logical extreme, something unexpected begins to happen. Somewhere, beyond the comfortable bounds of finite lists and everyday arrangements, order begins to bend. It loops in on itself and quietly collapses into contradiction. This is the Burali-Forti paradox, a deep and unsettling contradiction at the heart of set theory and the very idea of all possible orderings. The paradox begins with something seemingly harmless: ordinal numbers. These are not the same as the counting numbers you might remember from early school. They go beyond simply listing how many objects you have. Ordinals are a way of capturing position, first, second, third, and extending that idea into the infinite. After all the finite positions, after 1, 2, 3, and so on, you get to the first infinite ordinal, called omega. It stands as the position beyond all natural numbers. But you can go further. You can have omega plus 1, omega plus 2, omega times 2, omega squared. You can climb this ladder of infinite positions indefinitely. The realm of ordinals is not just infinite. It is ordered, layered, and strangely navigable. And so, mathematicians, curious and meticulous, tried to gather all these ordinals together into a collection. Let's take all ordinal numbers and form a set. That seems like a natural move. If ordinals are well defined, surely the collection of all ordinals should be a well-defined object too. But this is where the paradox reveals itself. Because if you collect all ordinals into a single set, then that set must itself have an ordinal number. It is, after all, a well-ordered collection. It has a structure, a place. But here's the catch. That ordinal would have to be larger than every ordinal within the set. And that's impossible, because every ordinal in the set is supposed to be, by definition, already accounted for. So we are forced to ask, what is the ordinal of all ordinals? And the answer is, it cannot exist. This is the Burali-Forti paradox, a contradiction that arises when we try to create a set of all ordinals. The moment we treat this set as an object, we ask for something that cannot be. The ordinal of all ordinals must be larger than itself. It must both include and exceed all that it contains. And that, logically, is absurd. It's like trying to climb to the top of a ladder only to discover that the ladder extends one rung above your highest step. No matter how far you go, there's always something beyond. And yet, you are supposed to be holding everything already. The paradox was first discovered in the late 19th century by Cesare Burali-Forti, a logician and mathematician exploring the foundations of set theory. At the time, the field was exploding with potential. The idea that all of mathematics could be grounded in set theory, a system where everything was made from well-defined collections, was intoxicating. But then this paradox arrived, like a quiet crack in the foundation. It wasn't loud, it wasn't flashy, but it was undeniable. It showed that some collections are too large, too fundamental, to be captured within the system they define. That when you try to collect all orderings, you reach something that defies being ordered. This was a turning point, a realization that not all sets could be treated equally. In particular, sets like the set of all ordinals had to be handled with care. They were not just big, they were inconsistent. They broke the very rules they were meant to exemplify. And so, mathematicians began to distinguish between different types of collections. Some were sets, manageable and well-behaved. Others were classes, too large to be sets, operating at a different logical level. The collection of all ordinals became a proper class, a kind of unreachable horizon within the landscape of mathematical logic. But beyond the technical fix, the paradox opens a deeper question about the limits of formal systems, about the danger of completeness. We often assume that with enough rigor, enough patience, we can define everything, that our intellectual frameworks can contain all truth. But Burali-Forti shows that some truths are too large to be housed inside their own definitions, that some structures collapse under the weight of totality. It's not that the ordinals are broken, it's that the act of collecting them all forces a contradiction. This idea echoes through many areas of thought. In philosophy, it resembles the ancient paradoxes of self-proof, the liar who says he is lying, the book that contains all books including itself. In theology, it echoes the question of a God so powerful he can create a stone he cannot lift. In logic, it anticipates Gödel's incompleteness theorems, which show that no system can prove all truths about itself without contradiction. Burali-Forti is part of this lineage, a quiet voice in the chorus of limits. And yet it is not a defeat. The paradox does not dismantle mathematics. Instead, it refines it. It teaches humility. It teaches structure. It reveals the need for boundaries, not because we wish to exclude, but because inclusion without limit leads to collapse. The difference between a set and a proper class is not just technical. It's philosophical. It's about recognizing that some things belong outside the frame, that not everything can be collected, labeled, and placed within the system. Some things must remain at the edge, shaping the system without being part of it. In this way, the Burali-Forti paradox becomes more than a mathematical curiosity. It becomes a metaphor for understanding itself. The idea that the act of total comprehension contains the seed of contradiction, that the search for a final, all-encompassing answer must always leave something unaccounted for. And yet, we continue the search, not because we hope to reach the end, but because the journey illuminates so much along the way. So what does it mean to think of the ordinal of all ordinals? It means confronting the boundary between logic and transcendence. It means realizing that some ideas are like the horizon, always visible, always beyond reach. And it means accepting that in the most complete systems, paradox is not an error. It is a signal, a point of tension that tells us where understanding meets its edge. Perhaps this is the gift of Burali Forti, not in solving a problem, but in revealing a truth about thought itself. That totality is not always possible, that closure is sometimes illusion, and that the most important ideas are those that challenge the system from within, pushing it to grow, to adjust, to become more honest about its own shape. So the next time you consider the idea of collecting all things, of ordering all truths, remember the paradox of Burali Forti. Remember the contradiction that arises not from chaos, but from too much order. And let it remind you that even in the most rigorous systems, there is always an edge, a point where clarity fades, a place where thought must pause, not in confusion, but in reverence. Because in that pause, in that moment of unresolved tension, something else begins to shine, not just knowledge, but wisdom, the teletransportation paradox. Imagine a quiet room filled with soft hums of advanced machinery. The air is still. At the center stands a sleek pod, smooth, metallic, almost futuristic in its stillness. You've stepped inside it willingly, believing in its promise. This is no ordinary machine. It is a teletransporter. With a gentle press of a button, it scans your entire body, every cell, every atom, every memory, every emotion. Then, almost instantly, that data is beamed across space to another location, perhaps hundreds of miles away. There, a new version of you is assembled, atom by atom, exactly as you were just a moment ago, identical in appearance, voice, thought, feeling. And then, back in the original pod, your body is quietly destroyed. Nothing remains, except the new you, standing at your destination, blinking, breathing, alive, or so it seems. But the question lingers, did you survive? This is the heart of the teletransportation paradox, a challenge not to physics or engineering, but to identity, to the sense of self, to continuity. At first glance, the process feels magical, efficient, clean, but beneath its surface is a philosophical riddle that has unsettled minds for decades. If the body in the origin pod is destroyed, and a perfect replica is created elsewhere, is that replica still you? Did you die in the process, or did you simply move? And if every cell is the same, every memory preserved, every sensation intact, should that not be enough? But then the deeper questions begin to stir. What does it mean to be you? Are you your memories, your biology, your consciousness? If someone were to make a perfect copy of you while you slept and destroy the original while the copy awakened, would you know the difference? Would the copy miss anything? Would you somehow still be gone? The paradox doesn't answer, it just opens a door. And on the other side is the fragile mystery of selfhood. Most of us carry an assumption that we are continuous beings, stretching across time, moment to moment. We are not merely patterns of data, we are subjects. We live inside our experience. We are not just observed, we observe. And yet, in the teletransporter scenario, all observable aspects of you continue. The new you laughs the same, remembers the same childhood, holds the same love, the same fears, the same scars. But are they yours? Or are they just simulations of your mind, housed in a new body, carrying on like an actor reciting your script? One way to navigate this is through the idea of psychological continuity. If the person who steps out of the receiving pod remembers being you and behaves like you, then maybe they are you. Maybe what matters is not the matter, but the pattern. Not the atoms, but the arrangement. After all, even in ordinary life, our bodies are constantly changing. Cells die, memories fade, yet we still say we are the same person. Why should teleportation be any different? Why should it matter that the old body was destroyed if the pattern lives on? But others argue differently. They say that identity is not just about replication. It is about persistence, continuity of consciousness. If the original is destroyed and the new one is created, even if the two are indistinguishable, the original still dies. It's not you who wakes up at the destination. It's a perfect copy. And for that copy, everything feels normal. But for you? Your stream of awareness ends in the pod, quietly, forever. And no one will know, because the new you smiles, steps forward, and insists that nothing has changed. This is where the paradox tightens, because now we must ask, is identity about what can be observed from the outside, or what is felt from within? If consciousness is not transferable, if it is not a stream that can be broken and resumed, then teleportation is a form of death. No matter how perfect the copy, the original vanishes, the light goes out, and a new one switches on somewhere else. But the flicker between the two, that is everything. And so the paradox doesn't just challenge technology, it challenges the soul. It asks us to define where the self lives. In the continuity of awareness? In the structure of the brain? In the information of the mind? If we are just information, then teleportation is safe. If we are something more, something not yet measurable, then the machine becomes a silent executioner, dressed in the language of convenience. Imagine, now, that the transporter malfunctions. Instead of destroying the original, it leaves it intact. You now exist in two places, perfectly duplicated, each unaware of the other until communication is restored. Both of you believe you are the real one. Both carry the same memories. Both say, I am me. But only one was first. Only one stepped into the pod. So, who gets to claim the original self? And does it matter? Or does the very existence of a copy dissolve the idea of uniqueness? This scenario adds weight to the mystery. It shows that identity may not be a singular thread, but a branching one. That the self is not a fixed object, but a process. One that can be forked, split, continued in multiple directions. But if that is true, then what happens to our sense of death? If the copy survives, but the original does not, can we still say you died? Or is your identity now something that can multiply, something that can live on, even in separation? The teletransportation paradox opens the door to countless thought experiments. Some find it thrilling, others find it terrifying, but either way it forces us to confront the fragile nature of selfhood. The realization that the I we carry so confidently may be less stable than we think, that what we call me may be a pattern of continuity held loosely in biology and memory, but not immune to duplication or disruption. Some philosophers argue that we must reject identity as a singular object altogether, that there is no true self, only a sequence of moments, stitched together by memory and narrative. In this view, teleportation is no more troubling than sleep. We disappear into unconsciousness every night and reappear each morning. But others push back, holding on to the intuition that something essential is lost when continuity is broken, that there is a difference between sleeping and dying, between copying and living. And perhaps they are both right. Perhaps identity is a spectrum, not a point, a story, not a fact. And the teletransportation paradox is simply the moment when that story falters, when the plot takes a twist we were not prepared to explain. It doesn't destroy the self, it illuminates it. It reveals that what we are is more complex than the sum of our parts, more delicate than pure logic, and more mysterious than any machine can replicate. So if one day the technology arrives, if you are asked to step into the pod, to trust in the promise of instant arrival, what will you do? Will you believe in the pattern? Will you trust that what wakes up at the other end is still you? Or will you hesitate, knowing that the person who steps out will never know whether something was lost along the way? The paradox doesn't answer, it only asks. And in doing so, it leaves you with a decision that no machine can make for you. And maybe that's the real gift of the teletransportation paradox, not in solving the problem, but in revealing its depth. in reminding us that identity is not a line but a labyrinth, that the self is not a thing to be transported but a flame, flickering, luminous, and perhaps uncopyable, a presence that lives not just in form but in the quiet thread of awareness that moves through time, untouched by replication, unbroken by space. The Stadium Paradox. Picture a stadium, not the kind filled with cheering crowds or echoing anthems, but a thought experiment, a quiet, imagined structure used not for sport, but for logic. It is vast and symmetrical, a place where reason takes form and motion becomes the subject of philosophical tension. This is the setup for the Stadium Paradox, sometimes attributed to ancient Greek thinkers like Zeno or later logicians who explored the contradictions of time, motion, and space. At first glance, the idea is simple, but like many paradoxes that survive the erosion of time, it becomes stranger the longer you hold it in your mind. The stadium is a space where motion is dissected into moments, where time slices into snapshots, and where contradiction quietly begins to build. Imagine 3 rows of identical objects, perfectly spaced, perfectly aligned. Let's say each row consists of a sequence of bodies or figures. Call them A, B, and C. The middle row, B, stands still. The top row, A, moves to the right at a constant speed. The bottom row, C, moves to the left at that same speed. At the beginning of the thought experiment, all rows are perfectly aligned. Each object in each row has a counterpart directly opposite it. But as time begins to move, just 1 unit of time, say, a strange thing happens. Row A has moved 2 units to the right, and row C has moved 2 units to the left. Now, the objects in row A, which were originally aligned with row B, have passed by 2 C objects in the same amount of time it took to pass by just 1 B object. This might seem trivial at first, like a trick of counting or a curiosity of perspective, but when you dig deeper, something unsettling begins to emerge. According to this setup, each moving row passes a number of objects in the stationary row. But if both moving rows are traveling at equal speeds in opposite directions, they appear to pass twice as many of each other as they do of the stationary objects, within the same duration of time. And this leads to a contradiction. How can it be that the time to pass one object equals the time to pass 2? How can the same motion yield different quantities of motion depending on the reference frame? This is the heart of the Stadium Paradox, a challenge to the assumption that time and motion are divisible in clean, objective ways. At its core, the paradox tests the nature of instants. What does it mean to say that something happens in a single unit of time? What is the smallest possible duration? Can you truly observe 2 objects passing in 0 time? The stadium becomes not a physical structure, but a metaphor for time's architecture, one that reveals cracks when we try to reduce motion to indivisible snapshots. It echoes the ancient struggles with Zeno's paradoxes, where motion becomes impossible under strict logic, yet undeniable in experience. In this stadium, we see motion and contradiction live side by side, whispering that perhaps our understanding of time is not as smooth as it seems. To modern minds, the paradox might appear solvable with reference frames, with relativity, with concepts from physics that tell us how observers moving at different speeds perceive time and space. And it's true that special relativity plays a role in reframing this problem. But even with that in hand, the paradox retains its haunting quality, because it isn't just a puzzle about motion. It's a mirror held up to the assumptions we make about continuity, that moments follow moments, that duration can be subdivided endlessly, that there is always a smallest possible unit of change. But the stadium seems to argue against that. It says, if you look closely enough, the symmetry breaks. Imagine yourself as one of the figures standing still in row B. You watch as row A slips past you to the right and row C to the left. You count. You observe. You note that in the time it takes for one A object to pass by, it appears that two sea objects have passed in the opposite direction. How is that possible? If both rows are symmetrical, if their speeds are identical, how can your experience be asymmetrical? Are you observing something true, or are you witnessing the breakdown of motion as an objective property? And this is where the paradox deepens, not in mathematics, but in meaning. The stadium paradox becomes a lesson in perspective. It reveals that motion is not absolute, that even in a world of perfect symmetry, experience can create imbalance, that counting bodies is not the same as measuring time, and that perhaps, in our quest to define reality through precise moments, we lose something essential, some fluidity, some hidden layer that resists being frozen into instants. The paradox also touches something ancient in us, the fear that logic can betray experience, that when we follow reasoning to its conclusion, it sometimes arrives at absurdity, that even the most rigid frameworks can fracture under their own weight. The stadium paradox is not meant to prove that motion is impossible or that time is broken. It is meant to show that the models we use to describe them are limited, that a picture built from snapshots may never capture the flow, that a sequence of fixed positions may never fully explain what it means to move. And maybe that's the real point. The stadium paradox doesn't want to be solved. It wants to be seen. It wants to remind us that even the most fundamental aspects of reality, time, space, motion, are not beyond mystery. They are layered, they are strange. They hold within them contradictions that logic alone cannot smooth away. And in that realization, we gain something not less than knowledge, but more than it. A kind of humility, a willingness to dwell in uncertainty. Think now of the modern world, where time is measured down to billionths of a second, where space is sliced into quanta, where every motion is charted, graphed, predicted, and yet the feeling of motion remains elusive. The sensation of time remains slippery. We live in a stadium of our own making, surrounded by clocks and equations, yet we still do not fully understand the flow we swim through. The paradox is not an error, it is a reminder that there are limits to slicing, that the world may not be built from instants, but from intervals, from experience. And so, the stadium paradox is not just about counting moving bodies. It is about what happens when we try to reduce life into pieces, when we imagine that motion can be caught like a still photograph. It asks us, what if time is not made of moments, but of motion itself? What if our attempt to define reality in discrete units obscures the truth? The paradox stands not to be answered, but to be absorbed, to settle into your thinking and disturb it gently, not with confusion, but with depth. So if you ever find yourself walking past a stadium, silent and empty in the light of dusk, think of the figures inside, those imaginary bodies gliding past one another in perfect rows. Think of time as a rhythm, not a ruler. Think of motion not as a sequence of frames, but as a feeling. And let the paradox remind you that even the simplest concepts, when turned inward, reveal an infinite maze. That clarity is not always resolution, and that understanding often begins where certainty ends. Frege's paradox. There is a quiet complexity hidden in every sentence we speak. We often take for granted the power of language to describe the world, to carry thought from one mind to another. But beneath the words lies a deeper structure, a web of meanings and references that allows communication to function. And when we begin to analyze that structure with the precision of logic, strange things begin to happen. Ideas fold inward, categories begin to shake, and questions that once seemed clear reveal layers of contradiction. One of the most subtle and enduring examples of this is Frege's paradox, a quiet storm in the realm of logic, identity, and meaning. Gottlob Frege, a 19th century logician and philosopher, sought to ground mathematics in logic. He believed that numbers, statements, and even truth itself could be rigorously defined through a formal language. His vision was ambitious, a system so precise, so finely built, that it could support the entire foundation of arithmetic. To do this, Frege needed a way to describe functions, sets, and classes using logic alone. He devised a powerful framework, allowing concepts to be treated like mathematical objects. In this system, you could refer to a class not just by its members, but by the concept that defines it. And that's where the trouble began. Frege allowed for something called Basic Law V, a rule that permitted the extension of concepts to be treated as objects. In simple terms, it meant that every property could be turned into a set, the set of all things that satisfy that property. So, for instance, the concept "is a cat" could become the set of all cats. You could then refer to that set as a logical object. This seemed intuitive and useful, but it also opened the door to a kind of self-notion that had long been dormant in philosophy, until a young mathematician named Bertrand Russell pointed to a crack in the system. Russell's insight came in the form of a question: what happens when you consider the set of all sets that do not contain themselves? At first it seems harmless. Some sets contain themselves, like the set of all sets, which includes itself as a member. Others don't, like the set of all cats, which is not a cat and thus does not belong to itself. But when you try to define the set of all sets that do not contain themselves, you step into a paradox, because if that set contains itself, then by definition, it should not. And if it does not contain itself, then by its own definition, it must. This is the loop. This is the contradiction. Russell sent this observation to Frege in a letter, and it shook the foundation of Frege's system, because this contradiction wasn't an external critique, it lived inside the very logic Frege had built. If a formal system allows such a paradox to arise, it cannot be both complete and consistent. And so, the grand edifice Frege had constructed, his formal foundation for all of mathematics, was quietly undermined by a single, elegant counterexample. The paradox came not from the failure of his ideas, but from their power, from the fact that when you allow your system to describe everything, including itself, it eventually folds into contradiction. Frege was devastated. In the second volume of his Grundgesetze der Arithmetik, he added a somber appendix, acknowledging Russell's paradox. He admitted that it threatened the consistency of his work, and though he would go on to explore alternative formulations, the damage had been done. The paradox had revealed a limit. It had shown that even the most precise logic could stumble when asked to account for its own definition. That self-critique, when left unchecked, leads not to clarity, but to collapse. But Frege's paradox is more than just a logical flaw. It is a deep philosophical puzzle about identity and reference. It forces us to ask what it means for an object to refer to itself, what it means for a set to include itself, what it means for language to describe language. These are not just technicalities, they are fundamental tensions that lie at the heart of how we think. We believe that statements have meaning, that words refer, that definitions define. But when those mechanisms point back toward themselves, the ground begins to shift. This is the same terrain where the liar paradox lives. The statement, "this sentence is false," creates a loop, a contradiction, that arises not from error, but from the structure of language itself. Frege's paradox is the liar's sibling. Dressed in mathematical precision, it reveals that even in the most rigorous systems, language can betray us. That clarity becomes confusion when self-recognition is allowed to roam freely. And yet, this betrayal is not a failure of thought, it is a discovery, a moment where the system shows us its edges. In response to this, later logicians developed new ways to manage sets and definitions. Russell introduced the theory of types, a hierarchy that prevents sets from including themselves by categorizing them into levels. Others created axiomatic systems like Zermelo-Fraenkel set theory, which carefully restrict how sets can be formed. These efforts were not just technical fixes, they were philosophical adjustments, ways of protecting logic from the very power that made it expressive. They were, in a sense, defenses against paradox. But paradox is not the enemy, it is the mirror. Frege's paradox does not destroy logic, it reveals its depth. It shows us that meaning is not simple, that reference is not linear, that selfhood, whether of a set, a sentence, or a mind, is not always stable. The moment you allow a system to talk about itself, you invite contradiction. And yet, we are always talking about ourselves. Every act of reflection, every moment of self-awareness, carries this same loop. We are both the observer and the observed, the system and the sentence, the set and the member. So what then is the lesson of Frege's paradox? Perhaps it is that no system can be both fully expressive and fully safe, that the cost of power is risk, that the ability to describe everything includes the ability to describe the cracks, and that truth, like light, casts shadows. The paradox is not an error, it is an invitation to think more deeply, to examine the foundations, to question what we mean when we say means. It teaches us that the most dangerous questions are not external, they come from within. From the definitions we take for granted, from the assumptions we never pause to notice. And maybe that's why Frege's work still matters, not because it succeeded, but because it failed with such precision. Because it showed us the limits of logic, not through confusion, but through elegance. It reminds us that even our most cherished tools must be held lightly. That language is not a mirror, it is a maze. That meaning is not fixed, it is fluid. And that paradox is not a flaw, it is a signpost. So if you find yourself caught in a loop of thought, where definitions blur and clarity slips away, remember Frege. Remember the quiet dignity of his system, and the equally quiet unraveling of it. And let it remind you that even in the most careful structures, there is room for wonder. That truth may bend, that logic may reflect itself, and that in the very moment a system breaks, a deeper understanding begins. Skollum's paradox. There are paradoxes that whisper, and there are those that quietly dismantle the very foundation of how we imagine reality. Skollum's paradox is one of the latter. A paradox that doesn't shout contradiction, but instead allows a strange, dissonant harmony to form in the background of logic and mathematics. At first glance, it appears simple enough, even abstract. But as you sit with it, as the idea gently unfolds, you begin to feel a deeper unease. It's the kind of paradox that doesn't just ask you to question an idea. It asks you to question whether your understanding of size, of truth, of meaning itself, can be trusted. To approach Skollum's paradox, we must first travel into the heart of set theory, the foundational framework that modern mathematics rests upon. Set theory gives us a way to talk about collections of objects, numbers, and structures. From it, everything else in mathematics can be built. In this framework, certain sets are infinite, some bigger than others. For instance, the set of natural numbers is infinite, but the set of real numbers, those that include every possible decimal between any two integers, is even more infinite. It's uncountable. This distinction between countable and uncountable infinities is crucial, and it's one of the pillars of classical set theory. Now, here is where things begin to shift. In the early 20th century, a mathematician named Thoralf Skollum was studying formal logic, systems of symbols and rules that allow us to express mathematical truths precisely. In doing so, he applied a powerful theorem from logic, the Löwenheim-Skollum theorem. This theorem states something that sounds innocent at first, that if a theory in first-order logic has any infinite model, then it has a countable model as well. In other words, if a system of rules can describe an infinite structure, then there exists a version of that structure where the elements can be listed, one by one, like counting numbers. But this theorem leads to something deeply unsettling when applied to set theory, because set theory, as we use it, asserts the existence of uncountable sets, like the real numbers. And yet, by the Löwenheim-Skolem theorem, there must be a countable model of set theory that believes in uncountable sets. A version of set theory that lives entirely within countable limits, and yet still thinks it contains uncountable infinities. This is Skolem's paradox, that, within a countable universe, uncountable sets can appear to exist. The model thinks they're uncountable, but from the outside, we can see that they are not. This contradiction isn't a contradiction in the formal sense. There's no logical inconsistency here. Both things are true within their contexts. But the philosophical tension is immense. It suggests that what a mathematical system believes to be true may depend on where you're standing, that what appears uncountable from within a model may in fact be countable from a higher perspective, that the very concept of size, of infinity, might be relative. And this challenges something very deep in us. We like to believe that mathematics is absolute, that it tells us the truth, independent of perspective, that a set is either uncountable or not, that a theorem, once proven, holds in every context. But Skolem's paradox says otherwise. It says that models can believe things that are not true in the larger universe, that truth is not absolute, but model ergonomy, that even the notion of the infinite can be subject to the lens through which it's viewed. This is not a small realization. It means that our most trusted language, formal logic, can lead to different worlds, each consistent within itself, yet differing in what they believe to be true. In one model, a set might be uncountable. In another, the same set, described by the same rules, is countable. From within the model, the illusion is perfect. You can't step outside to see the mismatch. You live in the reality your logic builds, and so does mathematics. Skolem's paradox reveals a subtle layer of relativism in mathematical truth. It tells us that first-order logic, while powerful, cannot fully pin down the structure of the infinite. It is too flexible. It allows for multiple interpretations, some of them countable, some uncountable. And this flexibility is both a strength and a limit. It allows logic to describe vast systems, but it also opens the door to ambiguity. It reveals that precision in syntax does not always guarantee precision in meaning. Imagine living inside one of these countable models of set theory. To you, the universe feels complete. You believe in uncountable sets because the axioms you follow say they exist. You believe the real numbers cannot be listed. You prove theorems about their properties. But from outside, a higher vantage point sees your entire world as countable. It sees every object in your universe laid out in a list. And yet, you cannot know this. You cannot detect the countability from within. Your logic is consistent, your experience valid, and still your beliefs are, by an external standard, incorrect. And that raises haunting questions. If your model is countable, but believes in uncountability, what does that say about our own understanding of mathematics? Are we ourselves living in a model that feels complete, but is, in some higher sense, limited? Do we believe in the infinite because our system is structured to generate such beliefs, even if the broader reality sees things differently? Skolem's paradox doesn't claim we are wrong. It simply suggests that our position may not be final. This leads to a kind of quiet humility, a realization that our knowledge may always be provisional, that the truths we discover, no matter how elegant, are embedded in systems that could be viewed differently from above. It's a philosophical warning against the arrogance of absolutes, a reminder that logic, for all its rigor, still depends on frameworks, and that frameworks, like lenses, shape what they. And yet, there is something beautiful in this, something deeply human. We seek certainty. We build systems to understand the universe, and even when those systems reveal their own limits, we continue. Skolem's paradox is not a failure of mathematics, it is a revelation of its depth, a demonstration that meaning can be layered, that truth can be contextual, that logic itself can reflect the structure of consciousness, always consistent within, but never immune to perspective. In this way, the paradox echoes across disciplines. In physics, we find similar tensions, quantum superpositions that depend on observation, frames of reference that shift with velocity, and models of the universe that vary depending on scale. In philosophy, we confront subjectivity, in ethics, in perception, in knowledge, and in mathematics, Skollem's paradox stands quietly, a signal that even the infinite is not immune to interpretation. So what do we do with this paradox? We live with it. We let it reshape how we view truth, not as a static point, but as a path. We understand that models are not wrong, they are just incomplete. That logic is not broken, it is profound enough to include its own reflections. And that mathematics, in its deepest form, is not about reaching the end of knowledge, but about walking the edge of understanding. The paradox does not ask us to reject uncountability or to abandon set theory. It simply asks us to recognize that even the clearest concepts, when formalized, carry assumptions, that our tools of precision may also hide ambiguity, and that somewhere, in the silent space between a model and its metamodel, lies a flicker of uncertainty, a whisper that says, there may always be more. So the next time you think of infinity not as a symbol, but as a reality, remember Skollem. Remember the model that believed in the uncountable even as it was countable. Remember that logic can be both consistent and incomplete. And let that reminder soften your certainty, not as weakness, but as wisdom. Because in that softening lies a deeper respect for the complexity of truth, the relativity of perspective, and the quiet, paradoxical beauty of thought itself. The Samaritan's paradox. At the heart of every society lies an unspoken promise, a kind of silent covenant between people and institutions, between the fortunate and the struggling, between those who can give and those who must ask. It's the idea that if you fall, someone will catch you. If you suffer, someone will help. This ethic of compassion, of reaching out to support others, is fundamental to how we imagine a good society. It's what drives welfare systems, public health care, disaster relief. But buried within this noble aspiration is a quiet dilemma, a problem that emerges not from malice or neglect, but from kindness itself. It's called the Samaritan's paradox. Named after the Good Samaritan, the traveler who, in the parable, helps a wounded stranger by the roadside, the paradox emerges when we try to formalize this act of compassion into policy. Imagine a world where the government promises to support its citizens in times of need. If you are unemployed, you will be helped. If you are sick, you will be treated. If you are hungry, you will be fed. It's a vision of care. But now consider this. If people know they will be helped no matter what incentive do they have to avoid risk, to work hard, or to save for the future? If help is always available, regardless of effort or choices, what motivates someone to act responsibly? This is the paradox. The very act of providing unconditional help can, over time, discourage the behaviors that make help less necessary. If the safety net is too soft, people may stop reaching for the rope. And yet, if the help is removed, if the Samaritan walks past, the suffering becomes real. Lives are broken. The moral cost is unbearable. The dilemma is not about whether to help, but how to help without making things worse. It is a tension between compassion and incentive, between altruism and responsibility, between heart and logic. Economists have framed this in the language of game theory, where two players, the helper and the one in need, each respond to the expected actions of the other. If the needy person believes help will come no matter what, they may not exert much effort, and if the helper sees that effort diminish, they may begin to resent their role. Over time, The system sags, trust erodes, motivation fades, not because people are bad, but because the structure quietly disincentivizes the very actions it hopes to encourage. But this is not a cold calculation. This is not about reducing compassion to numbers. It's about understanding the strange feedback loop that can arise when help becomes expected rather than appreciated, when the giver begins to feel exploited and the receiver begins to feel entitled. The paradox is subtle. It doesn't shout, it whispers. It appears not as a catastrophe, but as a slow erosion, a fading of gratitude, of agency, of balance. And yet, the alternative is no less troubling. To abandon help is to abandon each other. To believe that people will always do the right thing if left alone is a fantasy. Life is hard. Circumstances are uneven. Luck, birth, health, history, all shape the path we walk. A society that withholds care in the name of discipline risks becoming cruel. It forgets that the Samaritan didn't ask why the man was lying on the road. He simply saw that he was hurting and stopped. So the question becomes, how can we help in a way that empowers rather than enables? How can we design systems of compassion that still foster responsibility? The paradox doesn't offer an answer, but it invites us to look deeper, to realize that help must be given not just with good intention, but with wise design. That compassion is not enough. It must be paired with understanding. Some suggest conditional help, support that comes with requirements. If you are unemployed, you receive aid, but also training. If you are struggling, you are offered not just money, but mentorship. This is not to punish the vulnerable, but to preserve their dignity, to remind them that they are capable. That help is not the end of effort, but the beginning of opportunity. Others propose universal systems like basic income that eliminate the paradox by treating help not as charity, but as a right. If everyone receives support, the stigma disappears. The incentive remains because the support is not tied to failure. But even these solutions carry their own complexities. Conditional help can become coercive. Universal aid can become diluted. There is no perfect model, only trade-offs, only careful navigation. The Samaritan's paradox is not a problem to be solved, but a tension to be managed. A reminder that every act of giving creates a ripple, that generosity to be sustainable must also be reflective. And perhaps at a deeper level, the paradox points to something essential about human nature, that we are motivated not just by need, but by meaning. That people are not lazy by default, but demoralized when they feel unseen. When help comes with judgment, or when effort is never acknowledged, the will begins to fade. But when help is rooted in respect, when it says, "I see your struggle and I believe in your potential," then something changes. The paradox loosens, the dynamic shifts. The receiver becomes a participant, not just a recipient. In this way, the Samaritan's paradox is not just about economics. It's about psychology, about culture, about the stories we tell ourselves about worth and work and need. It asks us to reflect on what kind of society we want to live in, one where help is rare and earned, or one where help is abundant but wise, where the hand that reaches out is not heavy with judgment but open with hope. The ancient parable remains relevant because it reminds us that compassion begins with presence. The Samaritan didn't solve poverty. He didn't build a system. He simply stopped. He saw. And in seeing, he acted. The paradox that bears his name is a modern echo of that old story, a reminder that in helping others, we must also reflect on how we help, that our generosity must be structured in a way that uplifts. So the next time you pass someone in need, whether on the street, in a system, or in a conversation, remember the paradox. Not to hesitate, but to think. To ask not just, "How can I help?" but "What kind of help will restore this person's strength?" Because real help does more than alleviate suffering. It restores agency. It invites growth. It believes not just in the need, but in the potential beyond the need. And perhaps that is where the paradox finds its balance, not in policies alone, but in mindset, in viewing help not as rescue, but as partnership, not as a transaction, but a shared moment of belief. In that space, compassion and incentive no longer pull in opposite directions. They walk together. They become one. The elevator paradox. You walk into the building, step into the hallway, and press the button. The elevator light glows softly. You wait and wait. Again. It seems like every time you arrive, the elevator is going the wrong way. Either it's already ascending when you want to go down, or descending when you need to go up. And though it feels like coincidence, like bad timing, a question quietly arises in your mind. Why does this always happen? Why, more often than not, is the elevator moving away from the floor you're on? It's more than just frustration. It's a pattern, and this pattern forms the basis of something deeper, something quietly unsettling. The elevator paradox. The paradox is simple to state, but difficult to accept. It's the observation that elevators are more often found going away from your current direction than toward it. Or, more precisely, if you wait long enough on a random floor in a building with multiple floors and elevators, you'll find that most of the time the elevator is going down rather than up, or vice versa, depending on the building's flow. At first glance, it sounds like a psychological bias. We remember the waits, forget the smooth rides. But the paradox is real, it's mathematical, and it tells us something strange about motion, probability, and how we experience time. To understand it, picture a tall building, say 20 floors. Elevators move up and down all day, responding to calls from residents, workers, and visitors. Most people are traveling to or from the ground floor. The morning rush carries people up. The evening brings them back down. But here's the catch. Most of the building's mass, the people, starts or ends on the ground floor. So while an elevator may pass through many floors, it spends more time near the bottom than the top. Why? Because it stops more frequently there. More people request it. More enter and exit. And in that increased traffic, something unexpected happens. The elevator is statistically more likely to be moving downward when observed from a random floor. The paradox is rooted in what's called sampling bias. When you encounter the elevator, you are not observing it neutrally. You are inserting yourself into a dynamic system, a system that doesn't spread itself evenly. And so, the elevator's direction when it arrives is skewed by its operational reality. It's pulled toward demand. If more people are on the lower floors, the elevator lingers there, more frequently descending to pick them up. So even if the elevator spends equal time traveling up and down, your chance of catching it going up is reduced because it passes your floor less often in that direction. But the paradox goes deeper than buildings and buttons. It becomes a mirror of how we observe the world. We often feel that things are moving against us, that luck runs in the wrong direction, that events are skewed toward inconvenience. But perhaps, like the elevator, this is not personal. It's statistical. We are most likely to notice the wait when we are waiting, most likely to remember the missed ride, and least likely to count the quiet moments when everything works. The elevator paradox reveals how perception, shaped by timing and motion, can distort reality. This idea has echoes in other areas of life. In traffic, for example, it often feels like the other lane moves faster. You switch lanes only to watch your old one surge ahead. But this too is a sampling issue. You observe more cars passing you than you pass yourself, simply because you spend more time being passed. Or think of friendships and coincidences. People often feel that their friends are more connected, more social, more lucky, and often They are. Not because of chance, but because the people we observe most are those who are most visible. The social ones, the successful ones, the active ones. Like the elevator, they are more frequently moving through our mental hallways. Back in the building, the elevator dings. You step in, and now you're part of the system. Your movement affects the next person's experience. Your stop determines the elevator's new direction. This is another key insight from the paradox, that systems are shaped by the people in them. Every call button pressed, every floor selected, adds weight to the pattern. The elevator is not random, it is responsive. It moves where people need it, and over time, those needs form loops, patterns, and imbalances that affect everyone inside. Some buildings try to solve this with intelligent systems, elevators that group passengers by direction, or skip floors to reduce travel time. These strategies ease the perception of slowness, but they don't eliminate the paradox. Because the real tension is not in the elevator itself, it is in how we experience delay, in how we notice imbalance more sharply than balance, in how our minds are wired to detect friction, not flow. The elevator paradox also offers a quiet commentary on expectation. We expect fairness from machines. We expect balance, symmetry, responsiveness, but reality is rarely so obliging. Elevators are governed by demand, not fairness. Life, too, does not guarantee even distribution. Some things arrive quickly, others take longer. And often, the sense that we are waiting too long or missing too much comes not from truth, but from the angle of our perception. There's something gently philosophical here, that perhaps the world is not skewed against us, but our perspective is limited. We see only a slice of the motion, only the floor we're on, and we forget the full system, the complexity of movement above and below. The elevator is not late, it is elsewhere, serving someone else, responding to another call. And when it does arrive, it's because the system, despite its imperfections, still found its way to you. So what can we learn from this? Patience, perhaps, and perspective. The paradox doesn't call for cynicism, it calls for awareness. A reminder that our experience is always local, always partial, and that much of what feels like delay or resistance is just the echo of a broader rhythm, one we rarely get to see. The elevator, after all, is always moving, and if it seems to take too long, it's often because we entered the story in the middle, not at the start. In this way, the elevator paradox becomes more than a curiosity. It becomes a metaphor for time, for fairness, for the strange, looping ways in which systems unfold. It reminds us that balance does not always look like symmetry, that justice does not always feel like convenience, and that even when things appear to be moving away, they may still be moving toward us, just not on our schedule. As the doors close and the floor lights up, you realize something. The elevator is a quiet teacher. It hums with logic, it follows its path, it responds to signals without complaint, and it carries each person one by one through a system too large to see all at once. The paradox it holds is not a flaw, but a feature, a lesson in how we observe, how we wait, and how we think the world should behave. So the next time you press the button and the light glows, and you find yourself waiting once again, remember the paradox. Remember that what feels like delay may be structure, that what seems like unfairness may be complexity, and that even when the elevator is moving in the wrong direction, it is still part of the same system, still coming back around, still moving forward even in retreat. And in that realization, perhaps, there is a quiet kind of peace. Simpson's paradox. Imagine that you're looking at a set of numbers, a series of results lined up in columns and rows. The patterns seem clear. The conclusion's obvious. One group performs better than another. One treatment looks more effective. One choice stands out as right. The data, it seems, is speaking plainly. But then, something strange happens. A deeper look reveals the opposite. The pattern reverses. What once seemed true now seems false. The conclusion you trusted is suddenly uncertain. This quiet reversal, this unsettling twist, is the heart of Simpson's paradox, a phenomenon that doesn't just disrupt statistics, but challenges the way we see truth itself. At its core, Simpson's paradox occurs when a trend appears in several different groups of data but disappears or reverses when the groups are combined. The numbers tell one story in isolation and another when viewed together. It's a paradox not because of contradiction, but because of perspective. It reveals how easily our conclusions can be shaped, how truth can seem to change simply because of how the data is grouped, sorted, or framed, and it leaves behind a lingering question. If our most careful analysis can be flipped so easily, what can we really trust? To understand this, imagine two hospitals treating the same illness. In Hospital A, 80 out of 100 patients survive. In Hospital B, 200 out of 400 patients survive. At first glance, Hospital A has a higher survival rate, 80% versus 50%. But now look deeper. Suppose in Hospital A, most patients had mild cases, while Hospital B treated mostly severe ones. When you separate the cases by severity, you might find that for both mild and severe cases, Hospital B actually performs better. How can that be? How can Hospital B have better results in both categories yet appear worse overall? The answer lies in the distribution. In the overall comparison, Hospital A seems superior because it treated more mild cases, which naturally have better outcomes. But once you account for severity, the true effectiveness emerges. Simpson's paradox reveals how confounding variables, hidden or ignored factors, can skew perception. When these variables are unevenly distributed across groups, they can distort the apparent relationships in the data. What seems like a clear cause and effect may simply be a shadow cast by something unaccounted for. But this paradox isn't just a trick of numbers. It mirrors something deeper in the human experience, the way context shapes meaning. We often draw conclusions quickly, based on what we can see. We compare, without always accounting for hidden differences. And when new context emerges, our certainty crumbles. It's not just about statistics. It's about the fragility of inference, the ease with which our minds and our systems can be misled. Simpson's paradox has appeared in countless real-world examples. In medicine, treatment A might appear worse than treatment B overall, yet be more effective in every subgroup. In education, one school might seem to outperform another until you adjust for socioeconomic background. In criminal justice, a policy might look fair until you separate the data by demographic. The paradox doesn't lie in the numbers, it lies in the interpretation. It shows that truth isn't always at the surface, that clarity requires more than comparison. It requires awareness of what's underneath. The lesson here is not to distrust data, but to approach it with humility, to realize that even the clearest figures can conceal complexity. Simpson's paradox reminds us that our tools of analysis are not infallible. They are shaped by how we frame the question, by what we choose to include, and by what we overlook. It invites us to slow down, to question the story the data seems to tell, and to ask, what might I be missing? There is something deeply human in this. We like conclusions, we seek patterns, we crave certainty, and when the data seems to align, we breathe a little easier. But the paradox whispers, be careful. The world is layered. The obvious answer may be a mirage. The truth may lie not in the overall average, but in the contours of the details, and understanding may require more than a glance. It may require curiosity, patience, and the courage to let go of easy answers. Consider how this applies beyond statistics. In relationships, we may judge someone based on isolated moments, missing the fuller picture. In policy, we may evaluate success or failure based on surface outcomes, ignoring deeper forces at play. In ourselves, we may feel that we're failing in the whole while thriving in parts and not see the paradox in that. Simpson's paradox becomes a metaphor for the complexity of judgment, a reminder that things are rarely as simple as they appear, that summary obscures nuance, that clarity requires care. And yet, paradoxically, this doesn't mean we should abandon conclusions. It means we must approach them with layered vision, with an understanding that multiple truths can coexist, that zooming in and zooming out can yield different realities, and that wisdom often lives in the space between views, the place where conflicting patterns are not errors, but different reflections of a deeper whole. There's beauty in that, a kind of intellectual humility that doesn't weaken our thinking but strengthens it, a willingness to live with ambiguity, not as a failure of understanding, but as a step toward deeper insight. Simpson's paradox is not a trap, it's a teacher. It shows us how easily our minds can be misled, not by ignorance, but by framing. And it gently encourages us to keep asking, to keep breaking things down until the full picture begins to emerge. Think of it like this. You're standing at the edge of a forest. From one vantage point, you see only trees. From another, you see the pattern of the whole. But both are real. Both are needed. The paradox lives in the transition, the moment when you realize that what's true from one angle may not be true from another, and that knowledge, to be complete, must hold both views at once. In this way, Simpson's paradox becomes more than a quirk of data. It becomes a quiet philosophy, a reminder that the world is layered and that we must be willing to navigate those layers, to hold opposing patterns without rushing to collapse them, to understand that sometimes contradiction is not confusion, it's complexity speaking. So the next time you read a statistic or hear a claim or feel certain about a pattern, pause. Ask what might be behind it. What groups are being averaged together? What variables have been left out? What context might shift the meaning? Not because you should doubt everything, but because true understanding lives beyond the surface. It lives in the careful, thoughtful unpacking of what the numbers don't say. And in that unpacking, there is grace. There is space for uncertainty. There is room for wonder. The paradox doesn't tell you what to believe, it tells you how to believe more wisely, with patience, with humility, with the quiet recognition that truth, like data, is rarely one-dimensional. It must be seen from many angles before it reveals itself fully. Jean's paradox. There is a silence to space that feels eternal. We look up at the night sky and see stars scattered across a dark canvas, their light arriving from great distances and unimaginable times. This silent beauty invites wonder, but it also invites questions. One of those questions is both simple and cosmic. Why is the night sky dark? It seems obvious at first, because the sun has set, because it is nighttime, because the stars are so far away, but beneath that simplicity lies a deeper puzzle, one that touches on thermodynamics, entropy, and the very structure of the universe. It is called the Jeans paradox, named after the physicist Jeans Jeans, and it quietly challenges our assumptions about how the universe should behave. To understand the paradox, begin by imagining an eternal, infinite universe filled with stars. No edge, no beginning, just stars, evenly distributed, burning forever. In such a universe, you might expect the night sky to be bright, not dark. After all, in every direction you look, your line of sight should eventually land on the surface of a star. There should be no dark spaces between them. The sky should glow like the surface of the sun. This was a famous problem even before Jeans, called Olber's paradox, but Jeans extended the dilemma further. He wondered why, In a universe full of matter and energy, thermal equilibrium had not already been reached. Why wasn't the universe, in all its vastness, the same temperature everywhere? Why hadn't everything spread out into sameness? That question and its implications became what we now call the Jeans paradox. In essence, the paradox reveals a contradiction between the expectations of classical thermodynamics and what we observe about the universe. According to the laws of physics, systems tend toward equilibrium. Energy spreads, temperature equalizes. Over time, hot things cool, cold things warm, and everything drifts toward a stable sameness. In an eternal universe, this process would have already happened. The stars would have burned out, their heat dissipated evenly across space. There would be no structure, no stars, no galaxies, just a quiet fog of uniform temperature. And yet, that is not what we see. The universe is not in thermal equilibrium. It is full of hot stars and cold space. Galaxies spin, structures form. Energy is still moving from one place to another. The night sky is dark, not because there are no stars, but because something interrupted the process that would have otherwise turned the universe into a uniform glow. Jeans saw this and realized that the very structure of the cosmos suggests something strange, that the universe is not eternal in the classical sense, that it had a beginning, that it is evolving, that time and space are not endless stages, but unfolding events. This realization reshaped cosmology. The Jeans paradox helped prepare the ground for what would become the Big Bang theory. If the universe has not reached equilibrium, perhaps that is because it hasn't had enough time to do so. Perhaps the stars are not infinite in age, but were born at a finite point in the past. Perhaps space itself is expanding, stretching the fabric of energy, creating new conditions that prevent equilibrium from ever fully taking hold. And so, the dark sky became a clue, a signal that the universe is not static, but dynamic, not infinite and unchanging, but finite and evolving. But the paradox remains powerful, not because of its resolution, but because of its implications. It reminds us that even the most familiar features of the world, the darkness of the night, the flicker of stars, are deeply tied to the laws of entropy and thermodynamics, that structure, warmth, light, and life all depend on imbalance. That equilibrium, while often imagined as peace, would be the end of change. A truly balanced universe would be silent, uniform, inert. The stars would not shine. We would not exist. In this way, the Jeans paradox becomes more than a physical puzzle. It becomes a meditation on the nature of change, on the idea that life itself is an expression of imbalance, that energy flowing from one place to another creates the possibility for motion, for thought, for time. The paradox tells us that the universe is young, not because it is small, but because it is still uneven. And that unevenness is the engine of everything we know. Consider your own body, alive, warm, thinking. You are a localized expression of thermodynamic imbalance. Your cells convert energy, your brain organizes patterns, you are not in equilibrium, and that is precisely why you exist. The universe, in its grandest and smallest scales, mirrors this truth. It is structured, dynamic, and evolving because it is not yet done, because it is still moving towards something. The Jeans paradox whispers that we are not living in the ashes of a spent cosmos, but in the firelight of a still-burning origin. And yet the paradox carries with it a quiet shadow. If entropy always increases, if equilibrium is the inevitable destination, then what we are witnessing now is a temporary state. A moment of imbalance, a passing pattern in the long drift towards stillness. The stars will fade, the galaxies will cool, and eventually, if nothing intervenes, the universe may reach the thermal death predicted by classical thermodynamics. An endless night, not dark because of mystery, but dark because of completion. The paradox points toward that distant future, not to scare us, but to remind us that everything we see is precious, because it is temporary. But even in that, there is beauty. The darkness of the night sky is not a failure. It is a sign of beginnings. A reminder that we are living in a universe with structure, with story, with motion. The Jeans paradox is not a warning. It is a window. A glimpse into how the cosmos protects the conditions for life, not through perfection, but through imperfection. Not through stasis, but through the long dance of expansion, collapse, and renewal. And perhaps in this realization, we are invited to see our lives differently, to understand that struggle, growth, and energy flow are not obstacles, but necessities. That the imbalances we navigate between order and chaos, hope and doubt, silence and sound, are echoes of a deeper structure. The universe does not begin in balance. It begins in asymmetry, and from that, everything else unfolds. The paradox also invites humility. It reminds us that our place in the universe is not central, but significant. That we are part of a system that defies equilibrium, not because it is chaotic, but because it is alive. Every star we see is a signal of entropy at work. Every moment of warmth, of light, of awareness is a brief and beautiful resistance to the tide of stillness. We are not separate from the paradox, we are living inside it. So the next time you look up at the night sky and wonder why it's so dark, remember Jeans. Remember the silence, the order, the imbalance. And know that the darkness is not emptiness, it is context. It is the frame around a universe still writing its story. And we, small and fleeting as we are, get to read one glowing page at a time.